Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's convening, Transformative Justice, Young People, Credible Messenger Mentoring, and the Role of Faith. I'm really glad you can join us today. I'm Stephanie Summers. I'm the CEO of the Center for Public Justice, a Christian civic education and public policy organization that's based in Washington, D.C., with a mission to equip citizens, develop leaders, and shape policy in pursuit of our purpose to serve God, advance justice, and transform public life. Today's event is a follow-up to our January 2021 convening. I can't believe it's been a year already, that explored the need for juvenile probation reform and opportunities for the faith community to engage in this important work. We were so energized by our time together in January 2021 and the learning community that formed from that day. And we're so glad to see many of you with us today to continue the conversation. And to those of you who were not with us last year, we welcome you and we're really glad you're here today. Today, we're going to take a closer look at the role of faith-based organizations and houses of worship in juvenile probation reform and diversion efforts, with a specific focus on a promising practice called credible messenger mentoring. CPJ is focused specifically on juvenile probation reform because it's something that's overseen at the most local level of government. And because it's local, it means that people in the communities can get involved and make significant changes that will lead to better outcomes for young people, families, and communities. We've invited each of you to be here today because you are national and local Christian clergy and faith-based nonprofit leaders, your Christian academics and youth advocates, and your Christian professionals in the justice field who are already serving young people, families, and communities. You understand firsthand why the current system is not serving communities well. So thank you each for being here. We know that you're taking time out of serving your community to be part of this event today. We also want to acknowledge the incredible work that many organizations and congregations who are represented in this room already do in serving their communities, and in particular, young people touched by the justice system. So we come to the table today with a posture of mutuality. We hope to learn from you and your expertise and knowledge today as well. Just to top line our objectives for our conversation today, we're going to educate and learn from Christian leaders, clergy, public officials, and young adults about juvenile justice reform with the specific focus on the diversion practice of credible messenger mentoring. We'll cast a compelling vision for juvenile justice reform and why a model centered on family and community-based organizations, including faith-based organizations, will work. And we'll identify pathways for engagement on this issue, both as individuals and as organizations, as well as for the community that's formed during today's convening. We have a great afternoon ahead of us, and we're sad that we can't be in person again, but it has definitely created the opportunity for folks around the country to join us, and so we're glad for that. Would you do a favor and please drop, if you haven't already, into the chat your name, your organization, and where you're located today. And if you attended last year and you or your organization or church started an initiative as a result of the conversation, or developed a new partnership, or met with a public official to pursue juvenile probation reform since last January, we'd also love to hear more about that in the chat. Lastly, 2 housekeeping notes as we get started today. Could you take a minute to make sure your full name and your organizational affiliation is listed as your Zoom name? And if you would also not mind keeping yourself on mute, with the exception of our afternoon breakout sessions. The chat feature is going to be open throughout the entire convening, so feel free throughout to drop in questions as they come up. My colleagues Katie Thompson and Anna Kate Peterson will be ensuring that everything goes smoothly with the technology today. You should have received the agenda and a bio sheet by email, but Katie's also going to drop the links for those into the chat as well, just in case. And with that, let me introduce Yasmin Arrington, who is serving as our MC and who helped to plan and design our time together today, as well as in 2021. Yasmin Arrington was born and raised in Washington, D.C., She's a 2015 graduate from Elon University with a Bachelor of Arts in Strategic Communications and History. Yasmin earned her Master of Divinity degree from the Howard University School of Divinity in May of 2018, and Yasmin was a 2020 Center for Public Justice Sacred Sector Fellow, where she had the opportunity to serve as an advocacy intern with Prison Fellowship. In 2010, while she was still a junior in high school, Yasmin founded the nonprofit Scholarships, which is an organization that provides college scholarships, mentoring, and a support network to children of incarcerated parents, inspiring them to complete their college education. To date, Scholarships has awarded over $250,000 in college scholarships to 61 scholars with 22 graduates to date. So welcome, Yasmin.
Thank you so much, Stephanie, for that lovely introduction. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Transformative Justice, Young People, Credible Messenger Mentoring, and the Role of Faith. We're so glad that you could join us on this chilly Tuesday in January. It is just so great to see so many familiar faces and also new faces. We look forward to fellowshipping, learning, and growing with you today. Just to briefly share how the day is going to go, the next voice that you will hear is that of Reverend Ruben Austria. He will share a scripture reading and a reflection. Then we will have Mr. Clinton Lacey share a presentation on credible messenger mentoring models, followed by a panel with Reverend Ruben Austria, Bishop Darren Ferguson, and Ileana Pujos. We will then disperse into breakout rooms to debrief on what we've heard and brainstorm ways that we can get involved or further involved, and then reconvene for a report out, closing remarks, and a prayer. So without further ado, I will introduce our first speaker of the hour. Reverend Ruben Austria is the founding executive director of Community Connections for Youth. Reverend Austria is a respected advocate for juvenile justice reform and is recognized locally and nationally as an expert on community-based alternatives to incarceration. He is a 2007 Soros Justice Fellow and 2004 Robert Brown Foundation Research Fellow. Reverend Austria currently serves on the National Advisory Board of the Community Justice Network for Youth, the Steering Committee of the Juvenile Justice Coalition of New York, and is a founding member of the New York City Task Force on Racial Disparity in the Juvenile Justice System. This is by no means his full bio, but please refer to our bio sheet for our speakers and panelists and attendees' full bios. So at this time, I will turn it over to Reverend Ruben Austria.
Well, greetings, beloved. It is wonderful to be with you this morning and see so many friends and mentors, and also what I hope will be new friends. I have the privilege today of just sharing a reflection of scripture to open our time. And so we are going to go to the book of Exodus. I don't know if we're in a situation now where we still say, turn with me in your Bibles, if you have one on your desk, but I think we're going to put it's there in the chat. And why don't we just read through the text aloud, because it's good to hear the word of God. Amen. So Exodus chapter 1, verses 8 through chapter 2, verses 10. Then a new king who did not know about Joseph came to power in Egypt. Look, he said to his people, the Israelites have become much too numerous for us. Come, we must deal shrewdly with them, or they will become even more numerous. And if war breaks out, we'll join our enemies, fight against us, and leave the country. So they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor, and they built Pithom and Ramses as store cities for Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread. So the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites and worked them ruthlessly. They made their lives bitter with hard labor in the brick and mortar and with all kinds of work in the fields. In all their hard labor, the Egyptians used them ruthlessly. The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, whose names were Shipra and Puah, when you help the Hebrew women in childbirth and observe them on the delivery stool, if it is a boy, kill him. But if it is a girl, let her live. The midwives, however, feared God and did not do what the king of Egypt had told them to do. They let the boys live. Then the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and asked them, why have you done this? Why have you let the boys live? The midwives answered Pharaoh, Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women. They are vigorous and give birth before the midwives arrive. So God was kind to the midwives, and the people increased and became even more numerous. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families of their own. Then Pharaoh gave this order to all his people. Every boy that is born you must throw into the Nile, but let every girl live. Exodus chapter 2. Now a man of the house of Levi married a Levite woman, and she became pregnant and gave birth to a son. When she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him for 3 months. But when she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him and coated it with tar and pitch. Then she placed the child in it and put it among the reeds along the bank of the Nile. His sister stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. When Pharaoh's daughter went down to the Nile to bathe, and her attendants were walking along the riverbank, she saw the basket among the reeds and sent her slave girl to get it. She opened it and saw the baby. He was crying, and she felt sorry for him. This is one of the Hebrew babies, she said. Then his sister asked Pharaoh's daughter, shall I go and get one of the Hebrew women to nurse the baby for you? Yes, go, she answered, and the girl went and got the baby's mother. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, take this baby and nurse him for me, and I will pay you. So the woman took the baby and nursed him. When the child grew older, she took him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses, saying, I drew him out of the water. Beloved, it is my joy to share with you just a bit of how the scripture has spoken to me and helped me make sense of what is happening to our young people in the justice system. It's not going to be a sermon. You don't tell a preacher to have a sermon as an introduction because it'll take up the whole afternoon or the morning. But I see my good friend, Bishop Darren Ferguson, and the Reverend Doctor, and hope he will critique my homiletics and exegesis. But let me just share with you how I came to this scripture and how my situation that I was in shaped me. In the South Bronx in 1998, I had started working with young people in a community setting, and was disturbed by seeing how many young people were dying. Young people getting stabbed, young people getting shot, and talking to young people I was working with who had lost friends, and trying to understand why are you carrying guns? Why are you carrying knives? Why are you killing your own people, your own people in your own community? And as a young kind of a young Christian and somebody who had come from a very somewhat of a conservative church background that focused very much on the individual and very much on the role of the individual in making the right decisions, I was asking young people a question similar to the one that Moses would ask in chapter 2. Why are you hitting your fellow Hebrew? And in wondering about why are young people committing this violence against each other? Why are they hurting one another? I began to do what a good Christian does, to say, well, the answer has to be in the Bible, and I'm going to look in the Bible to see what does the Bible say about the destruction, especially of our young men. And as I got into the scripture, what I was surprised was that what God was concerned about, when you looked in scripture and see, where do we see losing a generation of young men? Where do we see losing a generation of boys? And you see that around the birth of Jesus, but you see it first in the Exodus narrative. And I started to see that perhaps I'm asking the wrong question. Perhaps the question that God is asking is not just, why are you hitting your fellow Hebrew? But why are my people in a situation where they are being abused, where they are being oppressed, where they are being treated ruthlessly? And I began to see that the God of the Bible is concerned not only about the individual decisions that people make, right, but also about oppression, also about deliverance. And that began to change my way of thinking. And so I want to share with you just briefly the reflections from scripture that have guided my work. And bring you first to 4 parallels between the situation of the Israelites in ancient Egypt and the plight of our young people today, especially those who are targeted by the justice system. As we heard in the scripture, it starts by saying a new king who did not know about Joseph came to power in Egypt and said, look, the Israelites have become far too numerous for us. We must deal shrewdly with them, or they will rise up against us. And in Egypt, the powers that be were concerned with a growing minority population, a growing population of people, perhaps of a different racial, ethnic, cultural, linguistic, religious group. And if you walk into our juvenile detention centers today, if you go into our court system today, you begin to see that we've moved beyond disproportionate minority confinement. We've moved beyond racial disparities to have almost total minority confinement. Right? You can go into any detention center in New York City today, and you will get between 99 to 100% of the young people are African American and Latino, and it doesn't change. And when you see who is coming through the system, by and large, it is young people of color. And you hear that the logic, the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread. So the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites and work them ruthlessly. And what we know from our country's history, what we know from scripture, is that fear tends to breed oppression, and oppression breeds more fear. That our current juvenile justice system is built on the politics of oppression and fear. In the 1990s, some of you may remember, there was a criminologist by the name of John DiIulio, who began to speak about the coming of the juvenile super predator and described young men of color in the urban center as brutal, without conscience, without remorse, and warned of a coming generation of ever more young people who would burglarize, rape, rob, deal deadly drugs, kill, steal, without the pangs of conscience, without remorse. And he concluded by saying, at core, the problem is that young people growing up in our inner cities are surrounded by adults who are themselves deviant, delinquent, and criminal. And while this may sound to us today like fear mongering, and it may sound antiquated, it was no accident that during that time in the 90s, that almost every single state in the union, in response to this fear of the coming juvenile super predator, would begin investing in building more prisons. They would build more maximum security facilities for young people. They would change the laws to try young people as adults, resulting in something like maybe about a 5,000% increase in the number of young people behind bars at any given point in a single year. And it was fear, right? But they put slave masters over them to oppress them, and they built Pithom and Ramses as store cities for fear of. And one of the things that I never really paid attention to in the story, later on when Moses is saying, let my people go, and Pharaoh says yes, and then he says no, and he changes his mind. And in this simple verse that they were building the store cities for Pharaoh, we realized that the Egyptians had become economically dependent on the slave labor of the Israelites. If they were to let the Israelites go, who would build the cities? Who would fund the enterprise? And in many places around the country, and I'm not just talking about private prisons, but even public prisons, state-run institutions have become dependent on people incarcerated to sustain cities. In New York, where I'm from, we know that there are no prisons. Really, there's no really incarceration facilities in the city of New York. They're all upstate. I mean, we have jails and detention centers and reentry centers, but for many years, the default was to build prisons in upstate New York that often became more for the benefit, the economic benefit of the towns and counties that were dependent on them for jobs, dependent upon them for census counts, dependent upon them to help pay the bills for things like water treatment facilities, dependent upon them for a whole economy. And so we've seen that sadly, the business of incarcerating people has become an economic enterprise that society is dependent upon. And finally, we see in the plan for oppression that this works to destroy a generation. Pharaoh gave this order to all his people: every Hebrew baby that is born, you must throw into the Nile. And a generation was literally being snuffed out. And it's not to say that every young person who goes into a facility is dying, but as I began doing this work in the early 2000s, there was a number of cases in New York where young people were dying in facilities, being restrained, held face down, kneeled upon, losing their lives. And it happened to Daryl Thompson in 2005, and it happened to Christian Rodriguez in 2007. And many of you have heard stories like the Khalif Browder story. But there are young people who go into facilities, and even if their actual life is not taken, their dreams, their hopes, their aspirations for the future are being snuffed out. I want to make sure now that before my time is up, I move out of Exodus chapter 1 and move into chapter 2, because as much as I love the scripture, and as much as I love our faith for being able to provide in some ways the tools for a social analysis of the problem, I still believe, amen, that we serve a God of deliverance, that we serve a God that when you see that things are the worst, that God has a plan to intervene. And I believe that there is a specific plan and a role for people of faith today to follow from this model. And so we see that in chapter 2, the first thing is that the child's parents saw that he was a fine child. They saw the gift. They recognized the beauty in this child. They knew that he was special, right? They knew that he was worth protecting. But like many parents, just having trouble raising young people. And we always say, I hear this all the time, and I beg you please to never say this, where people will say, you know what, it's not the kid's fault, it's the parents' fault. And a lot of parents are just doing the best they can, right? But are in a situation of oppression, in a situation where things get out of their control. And so his parents actually had to give up for a period of time, or put him in the hands of God, put him in the river. But it says that his sister stood at a distance to see what would happen. She watched and waited. And the Hebrew word for that waiting, it's not a passive waiting. It's like when Jesus told his disciples, watch and pray, be alert, look for an opportunity to intervene. And in God's sovereign plan, it just so happened that Pharaoh's daughter went down to the Nile to bathe, saw the basket among the reeds, opened it and saw the baby. He was crying and she felt sorry. And right at this point, Miriam, who people say is maybe just a 12-year-old girl, the sister of Moses, sees a strategic opportunity, and she steps out and she says, shall I get one of the Hebrew women to nurse the baby for you? And God gives favor to Miriam's request, and Pharaoh's daughter tells her, yes, go. And she got the baby's mother. And so this child who was one step away from going up the river, this child who was one step away from being lost in the system, right, or disappearing into the empire of Egypt, actually gets returned to his own mother, to his own community, to his own people, to his own faith tradition, to be nurtured in those early years before he goes into Pharaoh's house. And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, take this baby and nurse him for me, and I will pay you. So the woman took the baby and nursed him. And here's what I want to say to you, beloved, that not only was the child returned to the community for the community to raise him, but the family was given resources to do so. They were actually paid with resources from the system to grow and nurture this child. And so I believe that in this plan, we see a blueprint for God, one, for God's concern, that God sees the oppression of his people. He is concerned. He would say that to Moses in the burning bush some many decades later as he sent Moses back to deliverance, but that God is concerned. And because God is concerned, we can be like Miriam and stand with young people before systems that would want to put them in jail, that would want to sentence them, that would want to put them away, and say, do you want us to bring the resources of our community to bear on this young person? And I hate wearing my clergy collar, but if I ever wear it, it is in court in front of judges standing with a young person, because when they see the community of faith standing behind a young person, when they see somebody who's saying, I believe in this young person, I'm willing to invest in them, I'm willing to support in them, I'm willing to help look for an alternative, the outcome is so often favorable. Number two, we see that God has a plan not only for the community to be able to take care of young people, to support, to raise, to inculcate them the values, right? To know who they are, to know who their people are, but resources to pay. And in the state of New York right now, we are close to paying $1 million per year to lock up one young person, $1 million per year per youth. And the call that I would have us make, if you are not somebody, or if you are somebody who is standing with young people in the courtroom and saying, Your Honor, please give this young person a chance. But maybe your call is also to stand in front of the budget officers, to stand in front of the legislators and say, can we not redirect this money that is being used to destroy our young people into the communities that can use this to do the very things that the system cannot do with them. We've heard in the church, you can't use the devil's money for God's purposes. And yet in scripture, we see, as my mentor, Dr. Trullier says, we see that's exactly what happened, that God always has a plan to take the resources of the system and put them into the hands of the people for deliverance. And finally, and I will close with this because my time is coming to an end and I will be disciplined and obedient to the time frame. Let us recognize and let us look at our young people, not just as people that we need to rescue from the water. Yes, we need to pull the babies out of the river. Yes, we need to intervene. But God had a plan that was bigger than that, right? The baby that was pulled out of the water, God didn't just set up a system to have a whole lot of social workers in Egypt who would help babies who were being put in the water. He didn't just teach the Israelites how to better deal with their oppression and how to conform better to the powers that be in Egypt. But this very baby and his older sister, who was just a child herself, God would then years later send Moses, right? He would send this child back to deliver his people from bondage, to liberate. And as I've seen my role, and I say, hey, for myself, I've been given the privilege and the ability to pull some young people out of the water and to advocate for them to be returned. But the very young people, the very people who have been incarcerated, the very young people that we are trying to help and serve today are the ones that God has chosen to be the ones to lead his people out of bondage, not just to have a better oppression, right, but to come to the promised land. So thank you so much for letting me share this reflection with you. It's awkward on Zoom. I have no idea if you're saying amen or if you're saying, what is this dude talking about? But I will end my time there, and we'll be a little on with you a little bit later on in the panel. So thank you and God bless you.
Amen.
Amen. Amen. Thank you so much, Reverend Austria. What an amazing, wow, spirit-filled interpretation, analogy, and exegesis of the scriptures in Exodus 1 and 2, relating them to how we can care for and nurture young people who each have a God-ordained purpose on their lives. So thank you for those reminders. And so much of what you shared is very reflective of the things that we're seeing today with the treatment of young people, and how our society is heavily dependent on the economy, right? So thank you so much for that powerful call to action. And speaking of action, we will all of our speakers and panelists that you will hear from today are action driven. They're not just talk. They talk the talk, they walk the walk. And so at this time, I would like to introduce to you, to introduce to some and present to others, Mr. Clinton Lacey. Mr. Clinton Lacey is the president and CEO of the Credible Messenger Mentoring Movement, or CM3, or maybe that's CM to the third power, but which focuses on supporting credible messenger mentors who share similar life experiences with current justice-involved young people and are posed to have transformative impact on an individual, family, community, and systemic level. Previously, Mr. Lacey served as the director of the District of Columbia Department of Youth Rehabilitation Services, or DYRS, and deputy commissioner of the New York City Probation Department. Other positions held by Mr. Lacey over his 30-year career include project manager with the W. Haywood Burns Institute, director of the Youth Justice Program at Vera Institute of Justice, and associate director of Friends of Island Academy, which serves 16 to 20-year-olds at Rikers Island in New York City. Brother Lacey is an experienced trainer, writer, and keynote speaker on issues such as racial disparity, comprehensive reentry services, gang intervention strategies, and overall youth development. We will leave about, depending on what our time looks like, maybe about 10 minutes at the end of Mr. Lacey's presentation for Q&A. But in the meantime, as you hear and take in all the information that he's presenting, if you do have a question that bubbles up, please feel free to put it in the chat and we'll get to it towards the end of the presentation. So without further ado, Brother Lacey, you've got the floor.
Thank you so much, Yasmin. I appreciate it, appreciate you. And I want to say greetings, peace and blessings to everybody. Such an honor to be present today in this conversation and have the opportunity to share and to be in the presence of such awesome people, many of whom are family to me, our friends, our colleagues, our teachers, our mentors, and those who I haven't had the pleasure to meet and work with we're here together, united with a concern, with a passion, with a commitment to make change. And so in that sense, we are family, and in other senses as well. So I'm humbled to be here. I was interesting as I'm listening to the conversation. I thought about this before we started today over the last couple of days, but then listening to the introductions and listening to Ruben with his brilliant presentation of connecting the issues and the reality of today and what we're facing and connecting it to scripture and helping to remind us and uplifting the fact that it's in some senses not a new struggle. It's a legacy of struggle that we continue, but that there is indeed hope and that there is indeed power and opportunity for us to overcome. You know, I feel really at home. I feel really supported. I feel the love. It's so often in many of these conversations, and for many years, particularly doing a couple of tours of duty inside of government, trying to figure out how to bring authenticity and bring truth, right, and speak truth, but trying to manage the risk of alienating people, of losing the audience, right? Careful what words to say. As I talk a little bit more, I can even share a bit about, you know, initially not using the L word, love, that is, right? But of course, today I'm in such company that, you know, I don't have to be careful about talking about loving our young people, loving our families, and loving the community. We're rooted in that. And so I'm really, you know, happy to be in such a presence. But yet, the work is, and the challenges are serious, are huge. And so these conversations and the work that we're doing individually and collectively, I think is so important. And I think never more important. I was talking to someone yesterday who was talking about a generation of leaders, of pillars, of great people, men and women who are many of faith, who have led the way. A generation of them are passing away now. And so it begs the question, who will pick up the baton? Who will continue this work? I think it's not so much a question for the people here on this call today, because that's in fact what we're doing, but how do we continue to spread that sense of responsibility? Well, I think one of the ways that we do it is what I'd like to talk a bit about is what we're commonly calling now credible messenger work, and what that means, and how do credible messengers, in what way do they represent that next level of leadership? Not that credible messengers in essence are new, it's not a new thing, but how do we lift this up and be more intentional about investing in and supporting the work of critical, brilliant, necessary leadership that resides in our most challenged communities. I'd like to share my screen here and go through a few slides if I may. Great. And so just to perhaps tell a little story, and I will pause for a moment just to say, even on this photograph of our presentation there, my brother beloved, who many people on this call may know, is lives that name, beloved, and just pours love into young people. He's a credible messenger, and we couldn't think of anybody better to put as the face or a face of the work of pouring one's life into our young people. So I'd just like to talk a bit though about the larger context for credible messenger, right? And it's a word that's used a lot these days. It in some ways means different things to different people on a certain level. So I'd like to talk a bit about what do we mean by that terminology, but put it in a broader context. I think the context has been set here this morning by Ruben and by others. And so in terms of what are we actually talking about and what is the role and the meaning of credible messenger mentoring in the scheme of the challenges that we're facing and in the struggle that we continue to launch. So I'd like to take a moment to just talk a bit about history and perhaps cover some long period of history in just in a couple of minutes, but just with a few themes here, right? So we know that, and it's again, to make the connection between the scripture and the ancient nature of this idea and this practice of oppression and marginalizing people, and how that is played out through institutions and through policy and through practice. We still face that today. So of course, the justice, quote unquote justice, or perhaps more rightly called legal system in this country has, and the roots of it, particularly juvenile, quote unquote juvenile justice system, has really, quite horrible and destructive roots. We're aware of that. This is not news to us, but I refer to it as a punitive era. Like, the very roots of justice in this country, we know the work and the scholarship that has been done to document and to uplift the truth about the foundations of legal systems in this country. We know the connection between police abuse and the notion of policing and slavery. We know the prison system and the convict leasing system that grew out of slavery. We're well aware of the connections between what has become the legal arm of the establishment of this nation and its connections to the roots of slavery and oppression and segregation. And so the juvenile justice system grows out of the same thing. And so one of the things that was particularly harmful about the roots and the beginnings of youth justice in this country, I mean, it was never great for white kids. It was quite negative. In fact, the first law on the books in juvenile justice that took place in the colonies was called the Youth Stubborn and Rebellious Act, which said that a young person could be put to death up to at age 16 for being for disobeying, right? For being incorrigible, right? And disobedient. And so we know that young people in general, overall, were not receiving the kind of treatment that we know that they deserve or worthy of and should get. But of course, Black and brown young people in this country, it was just layered then in terms of the low expectations, the notions and narrative of their inferiority, that they were not worthy of care, of hope, of redemption. And all this played out in both the practice and in the settings and in the policies of juvenile justice as it grew. And so over the years, of course, there was struggle. We know that the juvenile youth court, first juvenile family court was founded in 1899 in Cook County by Jane Addams and other advocates who were fighting against racial oppression and fighting against the other ills in this society with great hope and aspiration that young people could be treated more fairly, more justly. But for youth of color, the oppression continued up until this day, of course. But over the years, starting then, if not before, there has been struggle. There have been reforms. There have been efforts by many people to try to improve the system. And I think over the last 30 years or so, we've really seen a heightening of focus and organization and resources brought to try to reform systems. Yet, and I think it's worthy to give credit and to acknowledge that in many ways, we have seen some improvements. We've seen models developed. We've seen standards developed for both creating alternatives to keep young people out of jails and detention centers and correctional centers, and to improve the conditions while they're there. Yet, sadly, a few things have remained intact. One thing is that of the over 3,000 juvenile justice systems in this country, excuse me, it's really only been hundreds that have taken serious steps. And so many places still continue horrible treatment of young people in terms of torturous policies. I say torture, such as solitary confinement and pepper spray, right? And mechanical restraints. So this continues. But even in those systems that have really tried to move forward to make systems kinder, right? More humane, smarter, utilizing evidence-based practices, more efficient with resources, is still grappling with some critical unresolved issues. The system has become blacker and browner, right? My 6 years in DC as a director of DYRS, not one single white child came into the system in Washington, DC. And Washington, DC is not Chocolate City as it used to be called. It's less than 50% African American. So this racial disparity, this disproportionality that Ruben talked about persists, and in fact, it's gotten worse. But I think one of the greater or equally significant critiques of the reform era has been that it has been largely driven by systems and system leaders, many of whom have gotten religion on the issue and realized that what had been happening for many years needed to be changed. And so certainly there have been improvements, but the perspective, the voice, the insight, the contribution of those most impacted by the system have not been incorporated into this reform process. And so really, when we talk about moving into a transformative era, an era that's healing centered, an era that's committed to restorative practices, right? A transformative system where community really is at the helm of defining values, policy, practice, right? If we talk about that, then we know that it has to come from the voices of those most impacted and from the families most impacted and the communities most impacted. And so the transformative era really, I think, is the context for credible messenger work. Because what this is really about is moving from the historic and ongoing reliance on systems and system leaders, right, to reform and improve services to treat and care for our young people, and shifting that reliance and shifting resources to the community. That community can take its rightful place. The village that everyone says it takes to raise our children needs to take an empowered position to care for, to heal, to, if you want to use the word rehabilitate, right? To serve our young people. And so in order for that shift to take place, there has to be a shift in resources, and I think a shift in identity on the part of systems. And the only way that shift comes is through the incorporation of community voice or the village. So Credible Messenger really is about investing in the village. Credible messengers represent, yes, those who have been most impacted, most marginalized, directly involved many times in the justice system with that shared life experience, investing in their capacity to become the healers, the program directors, the leaders, the policy reformers, right? The culture changers, to transform this very idea of what our justice system is. That's what Credible Messenger is. Some, the most cynical, will reduce Credible Messenger to scared straight, right? Put the kids in the room with the tough guys and they'll scream at them and they'll let them know, you know, what jail is really like and how bad the streets can be, and they'll straighten them out. There are some in government now who are issuing grants who have something in that akin to that idea of what credible messenger is. Certainly it's not that, but it's even more than the healing and engagement of young people, which we'll talk about momentarily. It is about transformation of the very idea of justice and how communities must play the leading role in serving and nurturing and healing our young people. So that's the broader context, right? It's about building capacity. Reverend Rubin talks about this. His organization is dedicated to that, building the capacity of community organizations. And so credible messengers, those who are rooted in community, who have shared life experiences, who have been marginalized in various ways, who have made a conscious decision that they are going to be part of a healing restorative process, that they're going to be part of the solution, that they are going to bring hope and help, but also new ways of practicing justice, new ways of resolving conflicts, and new ways of serving people. That's who credible messengers are. Then it's not just a program, right? It's not just a new way of even serving young people. It is a transformative idea of the practice of justice itself. And so if in fact the village is going to take its rightful place, then we have to invest in that village. And I think that's what's necessary and what in some instances is beginning to happen, but needs to be accelerated significantly. So in New York City, to make a long story short, you know, in the introduction, Yasmin talked about, I had the opportunity to work with young people at Rikers Island for many years, and then spent time with among other things, with the Hayward Burns Institute, traveling the country, working on racial and ethnic disparities. I had the opportunity, unlikely, not something I thought would ever happen or even thought or wished for, but I got invited to become the deputy commissioner of the probation department under Vinnie Schiraldi in 2011. And so when we got to probation, and because Vinnie said it was because I had never been a PO, had never worked in government, had never worked in law enforcement, and had a community-centered perspective, these were the types of people he was trying to bring together to reimagine what justice could be, what probation could look like in a city that was wedded to stop and frisk policies, right? That had horribly antagonistic relationships between law enforcement, the law enforcement establishment, and the key communities that were being targeted and impacted. And so through the hand of God, through faith, through the complexity and nature of things, he ends up becoming commissioner in the midst of those policies and brings in people. And so within probation, which perhaps not too many people were paying attention to other than those who were on probation, the 25,000 people who were impacted by probation, we began to have conversations about this very question about what is justice? How can we reverse the harms that probation and the justice system was doing to Black and brown communities, to young people, right? In what way could we begin to reinvest in communities, to share decision-making, to really listen and create space for community, right? To say, this is what we are facing. This is what we need. This is the reality. And so we began to engage people like Bishop Darren Ferguson and Eddie Ellis. And of course, Reuben we've been attached back before that, even before I got to probation. And we began to think about, what does community engagement really look like? How can we create change? And so the first thing we did was created what we called NEONs, Neighborhood Opportunity Networks, which was really about going into the communities and transforming our probation centers into community centers, right? Whether it be services and opportunities and space, and where community felt like this was their place, right? So that was the context for when the Young Men's Initiative came and some funding came, we launched Arches, Transformative Mentoring. And essentially that was what we now are referring to as credible messenger work. I think it's important though to point out, as I said before, that, you know, and the work of Darren, the work of Eddie Ellis, the work of hundreds and thousands of others before us, but even at that time in the community, these were people who had been impacted by systems in a major way, who were out there doing the work. But what we were able to harness at probation was to bring this idea, this legacy of work, and bring it to the justice system and say, this is the way we're going to do business. This is the way we're going to redefine our culture and our policy as a justice system, as a justice agency. And that's what the work at New York represented. And so we put 20 grants into the community and the target neighborhoods, 7 target neighborhoods, which Eddie Ellis and his brothers in prison had identified through their research in the think tanks inside of Sing Sing and other prisons. And it ended up being the same 7 neighborhoods, which were the leading sources of incarceration and those on probation. And we funded programs and we worked hard to make them, and Ruben walked with us through this process to reach the grassroots, right? To fund grassroots organizations, some of whom were faith-based organizations, to hire and support credible messengers to do evening and weekend work with our young people on probation, 16 to 24-year-olds, but also to be available 24 hours a day. And the narrative started to emerge of 4 o'clock in the morning, people calling their credible messenger, who they had begun to trust, who they knew they could turn to, who they knew loved them, and who understood their predicament and their situation, and say, I see the guy who killed my brother, and I'm about to do something about it, right? A call for help. And with credible messengers responding, people calling and saying, contemplating suicide, people experiencing hopelessness, reaching out to credible messengers. And so what the result of that was multiple, but one of the key takeaways from the Urban Institute was a 60% reduction in recidivism. And so, which had been unprecedented in terms of numbers. So just from a sort of formal measure of rearrest, right? And keeping people out of jail, that was a drastic, unprecedented reduction, but it was also a demonstration in this process. In addition to that, what it demonstrated was that if you invest in people who couldn't even become a volunteer at the Boys and Girls Club because of their felony record, couldn't get in the door of a school, couldn't join most programs, people who had been marginalized and written off, like their communities, but who were the face of that marginalization, right? If you invested in that community and built capacity and provided support and space and opportunity and access, that they could have transformative impact. Well, the transformation on young people was quite clear. And we saw organically the culture change beginning to happen at probation. I started out by joking, or really not a joke, it's true. At probation as a deputy commissioner and working with the staff that we inherited, largely Black and brown folks from New York City, very punitive culture, very ugly history, and quite a bit of skepticism, if not antagonism, towards this idea of partnering with people who had been to prison, partnering with people who had led gangs, right? Partnering with people who used to be homeless and what have you, you go down the list. This idea of bringing them in to be the front line, engaging our young people, right? That was difficult for some to accept. Some bought in initially, right? But it was quite a bit of culture change work and team building and putting people in rooms together to make this happen. So again, it was controversial to use words like compassion. It was controversial when we referred to people on probation as clients. People wanted to objectify, people were used to objectifying people, defendants, offenders, at best probationers, right? But our work was to not just humanize the population, but to bring representatives from the community who had been there, who had been so labeled, who had come through that to be the front line of engagement. And that's what that demonstrated, that there was an opportunity, a viable opportunity to reinvest, funding from the apparatus of the system, which clearly has failed, into the community and into the communities which have for so long been blamed as the source of the problem. Well, we moved in 2015. I had the opportunity and became appointed by the new mayor at that point, director of DC's youth justice system called DYRS, serving roughly 14 to up to 21-year-olds in our system here. And in DC, essentially functioned like a probation department. We had responsibility for kids in the community, supervision and engagement, and also ran a detention center, as well as a post-commitment youth correctional center called New Beginnings, which has been the subject of quite a bit of attention with regards to its the approach to try to make it as loving and home-like as possible. But one of the things I wanted to talk about with the move to DC is we took that experience with us from New York, and lessons learned, and we expanded the program and the approach, and we expanded it in a couple of important ways. One was that it was no longer just about that young person committed by the court, and so now the families and the adult caregivers were served by credible messengers. So a young person committed to DYRS received a credible messenger, and their grandmother or mother or father or siblings now had this access and support and this wraparound by a team of credible messengers who had been, again, met that same criteria, who had that same experience, who were now the front line of engagement and care for our young people. We also expanded into our facilities, and we brought credible messengers into the facilities who work from 7 in the morning to 3 in the morning there, not just as people running groups here and there, right, which is a struggle in many places, right, but infused into the culture and to the policy and to the practice of the facility, which I could speak about momentarily before I close. But when we got to DC, I just want to pause for a moment and really make a point here that before we got into, policy practice, and I inherited a department who, by the way, had been led by Vinnie Schiraldi, and there had been radical changes made there. They had closed this dungeon of a hellhole called Oak Hill, where abuse and torture was taking place, and they had opened up a new facility. More kids were in the community. There were programs set up for them. So we inherited that. But when we got there, before we got into, okay, here's the initiative, here's the policy, here's the practice, we called a timeout. And the first thing we said was, this is about love. The experience in New York, perhaps the conditions weren't there, perhaps I wasn't brave enough at that point, but when we got to DC, we declared it. We said, we are basing everything we do on an idea of love. We talked about and uplifted Dr. Martin Luther King's words, that his question of what is justice? He said that true justice is an act of love in public policy. So the question became for us was, what does love look like in public policy? What does love look like in a juvenile justice agency? From assessment to intake, to development of individualized plans, to support and navigation of those plans, whether that young person is in the community or, God forbid, if they were inside one of the facilities. And so this conversation, this examination for us was critical, because so often there's a jump to policy and practice. And we were like, no, what are the values? What do you believe about young people? Do you believe what DeLilio said years ago about the super predator? Because the Black community consumed that, right? Not just the right wing. Staff at agencies like DYRS across the country consume that, perhaps not literally, but that legacy lives on. So the question for us was, what are our young people worthy of? What do they deserve? Do they have to earn your love, or are they worthy of it as human beings? And given that they're worthy of it, how do we infuse that into the practice, into the policy? and into the actual experience of the young people, right? Maya Angelou said, young people won't remember what you did for them, but they'll remember how you made them feel. So how do we infuse love into how young people feel about being here in the justice system, right? Which happened for bad reasons, right? Poor conditions, oppression, bad decisions, what have you. And that for us was fundamental, and I think it's fundamental to a conversation about credible messenger, because it was at that point that we began to infuse credible messenger into the work. So while in New York at probation, some credible messengers were so powerful, their approach, their culture was infectious to probation in a positive way, and we saw the results of it. But it wasn't systematic. In DC, we took a systematic approach. And I often say in New York, the probation officers and the credible messengers dated. It was like dating. In DC, we said, we're gonna do arranged marriage, mass arranged marriage. So we brought in credible messengers into the mix, literally and figuratively, into our system, at the table at assessment, at the table and developing individualized success plans for young people, plans for co-navigating, partnering with case managers who were responsible for case management and community supervision, right? Partnering inside with the facilities with behavioral health team, restorative justice experts to create what a day and evening in the life in the facility would look like, right? So, because this was the way we knew the only way to really change and foster change of culture and practice and infuse love into a justice system of all places. And so credible messengers represent the infusion of love and community. If young people, I often say, particularly young people incarcerated, if the young person can't be in the community, well, let's bring the community to them. If the young person is committed to a justice agency, which by its very nature restricts their movement, even if they're in the community, they become institutionalized, isolated in many ways, right? Sometimes that we don't even realize. So how do we ensure that they don't get disconnected from community? We bring community to them and wrap them around in the form of credible messengers to be their life coaches, big brothers, big sisters, co-navigators, not just responding to crisis at 4 a.m, but knocking on the door and ringing the bell at 6 a.m. Let's go to school. Let's go to our program. Sending messages of hope and love and inspiration throughout the day, right? Being there in a non-judgmental way. And so that's the essence of the work that I think layers then these aspects of training that we pour into credible messengers, right? That's the essence. And so then these are some of the things that we pour into credible messengers as tools in their toolbox to heighten their effectiveness and ability. So you can see it there, right? As we talk about, positive youth justice as a foundation and on down the list, right? Understanding the developmental stages of young people, being strength-based, understanding that hope is a thing, that it's a very real thing that isn't usually measured or asked for as an outcome, right? But that without it, we're not going to have positive outcomes, right? And so these types of conversations, not just when we say training, not just pouring into mentors, but creating space and opportunity for the credible messenger mentors to uplift that, to discover that, to share that through their experiences. And that's been the walk that we've taken to really create space and opportunity for credible messengers. And over the course of time, I would just say in DC, and we noticed that violence interruption programs who are practiced by credible messengers, right? Folks from the community who meet that description we talked about, outreach workers, mediation, these various types of approaches, are part of the continuum. We've emphasized in our work, not just the crisis intervention piece, which is critical, but that ongoing embrace, co-navigation, walking with people literally and figuratively. That's more of the model of CM3, that we're emphasizing that longer term care. But the whole continuum is important, of course. And so it's growing. And so we had a summit in 2018. And Ruben and I were able to get some funding from the Public Welfare Foundation. And we brought together about 300 folks from around the country. And it was really then that we, this idea of starting an organization to advance and support credible messenger work around the country, I think really gained greater life and inspiration. And so our people around the country and around the world get this, are doing this, are living this. And it's our work to try to spread the love, the support, provide curriculum, frameworks, navigation, negotiation with government, building capacity of organizations. I just want to close on this last slide because something that happened along the way, brother, one of my, John Ducksworth, one of our good friends and colleagues, who is one of hundreds of what I kind of refer to, particularly outside of New York, as a sort of untold story of hundreds and hundreds of people who have left prison, who have come out. Darren is one of them, and one of the key among them, and can tell the story of who came out of prison and who received theological training in prison, degrees, came out and are leading organizations and have been doing so for a generation now, if not more. But through that process, John, and he's one of them, and he gave me the book, The Wounded Healer, and by Henry Nguyen. And it was such a powerful document, a powerful little book, I don't know, about 100 pages or so, that I read and reread and used in my training and culture change process and engagement with staff in our culture change walk in DC. And it's written as a book to Christian ministers, right? That's his context. And essentially ministry in a contemporary society. In our own woundedness, we can become a source of life for others. And so the book talks about the current society and what people are facing, the marginalization, the hopelessness, the oppression, which of course we know is manifold, which is right, which is compounded in Black and brown communities. It's a global problem, but it's compounded in our Black and brown communities who are so impacted by this justice system. And so it's really very powerful. And I just wanted to share a couple of things, because as he speaks to Christian ministers, I read it and he speaks specifically there, but he's speaking to all people engaged in ministry, right? And it's interesting how in many other nations, the ministry of, there's the ministry of justice, right? That's the agency, right? And so we began to talk to credible messages to staff as, you are a minister of justice as love. And to embrace that and to take that approach and sense of responsibility and sense of grace to be empowered in such a way to be a minister of justice and of love to marginalized people, and in this case, obviously, our young folks. And so, a couple of key points that I underline and refer to in the book, among many, in the book, The Wounded Healer. Of course, first, before anything, the acknowledgement that we all are wounded healers, like we're all wounded. I know that much anyway. And so, and hopefully we all, and I know we all have the potential to be healers. So it's an acknowledgement and understanding of our wounds that connects us to all human beings, to our brothers and sisters, to the most confused, delayed, struggling, mean, whatever adjective we want to use, a young person who's done something really horrible and hurtful, which some of our young people have, right? That we know that, we are them and they are us, right? And so how do we as human beings connect and see the God inside of them, see the potential inside of them, wherever they are, even if they're doing life somewhere, how do we see that in them, nurture that, pull that up and lift that up? So with that message, you know, we just really focused on a few areas. And one of them that I used to like to talk about, and then I'll close, is when he talks about the minister as an articulator, he talks about that our people, our young, particularly our young people, need to have their experience, their feelings, they need support and being able to articulate what they're feeling. Because the language that the system speaks doesn't even speak to what's actually their experience. So they're not even speaking the same language. So how can ministers articulate for people to help them begin to articulate for themselves what it is they're feeling, what it is they've been through, what it is that they're experiencing, what it is that they need, what do they hope, what do they wish for, right? What do they deserve? And which helps to clear confusion, because the confusion is only compounded by systems. So how do we clear confusion and help instill hope into people? By articulating that inner experience, which so often is ignored or, in fact, twisted, or maybe even co-opted. And then he talks about a new definition of authority. That the new definition of authority, if not new, for us to go back to, needs to be compassion. That the highest level of authority needs to be grounded in a notion of compassion and love for others. And so these are the things that we were pushing for. And I remember, you know, at DYS, some of the staff were like, I don't know, Lacey, man, I'm not so sure about all that you're saying, but we grappled with it, right? And it began to infect the culture in some positive ways. We uplifted these ideas and continue to struggle, but work towards them. And the last one was, he talked about the minister as a contemplative critic, as a true, thoughtful critic of this establishment, the white supremacist framework, right? The entrenched poverty, right? The various institutions and policies that perpetuate oppression, that we critique those, right? And in that sense, are revolutionary. And then able to change the course of history by not just critiquing those systems, not just by promoting healing of our young people, but of reimagining and creating new processes of justice that are based on compassion. So Wounded Healer changed my life, continues to, and there's a lot more to come, I'm sure, in my learning and growth and development, but it's been very informative to this idea of credible messenger. And I believe a real source, not just that book, but all that has been said today, and this, the faith community as playing a critical role in this movement to advance credible messenger work and advance transformation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brother Lacey. I don't know, you probably couldn't see it, but this chat is popping. Like, everybody is so engaged and really taking in everything that you shared, Brother Lacey. And I didn't even know, I must admit, and I'm very happy and excited to be enlightened to learn how far back you, Reverend Austria, Bishop Ferguson, Eddie Ellis, and others, how far back you go and how long you have been in the trenches, you know, in communities, in grassroots, faith-based organizations, churches, agencies, doing this work day in and day out. And so I'm just so happy once again, and we're excited that you took the time to be here to share with us. I only saw one question in the chat, so we're doing fairly well on time. But I will go ahead and pose this question to you, Brother Lacy. And again, if anyone, if there are any questions that bubble up for you, please feel free to share those. We'll take a break. I would say if there are more questions, maybe we can go to 12:30. But if not, maybe we can end a few minutes early and go for a break and then come back for our esteemed panel. So the question, one second, this is from Eugene. I think you used the term youth justice instead of juvenile justice. Can you talk about the use of humanizing language in the youth justice system? And do you see us continuing to use the word juvenile, which itself is a loaded term?
Wow, yeah, thank you, Eugene. And another close friend and colleague, it's so good to see you. Yeah, the juvenile justice, it's even in its best, it's sort of been an oxymoron in our system, right, in terms of the lack of true justice for our young people. But it is loaded, stigmatized. So we move away from that kind of language. And I do think language is really important, and that we continue to find the best terminology to help lead us to where we want to go, right? And so, certainly moving from juvenile justice to youth justice, some organizations within the system now are beginning to move away from even the word justice. I mean, the thing about that is, it reminds me of the word public safety, right? And it's sort of so loaded and stigmatized, right? It represents some of the worst of what the right and what the establishment has done, from murder to torture and incarceration and what have you. And then there's an argument, no, we need to take that word back, right? That we own public safety, right? And it doesn't mean what they said it meant. It means that we care, right? We care. So there's a conversation going on, yeah, but what's a more beautiful way of saying that, right? What's a more aspirational way of saying safe, well, healthy, whole communities, right? Where our children and grandmothers can walk the streets and what have you. And so the same for justice system itself. I love Dr. King's words about what true justice is, but I also am really quite interested in the creativity, particularly of young people, as they're describing what this process ought to be. It's funny, at the end, I was saying that we need a transformative process. I didn't even use the word system, right? Because that's so loaded. And so not to just get lost in semantics, but I think that if to the extent that we can begin to uplift words like restoration, like care, like hope, and ultimately like love, right? So when I got, like I told you, I didn't use the L word in New York in public, like at probation meetings. When I got to DC and started using it, it was pretty funny. People at cabinet meetings and others, my colleagues and other folks would, or even in the community, be like, oh yeah, that's the guy who was talking about love all the time, right? Like it was like this new, almost controversial thing, And I'm like, so we gotta get used to it. We gotta embrace it and make that a part of our normal way of talking, because I think that will help guide us in the way we think and the way we act. So yeah, great point. I think language is hugely important, and that we can be creative and loving in the way we describe what we're actually doing in its essence.
Thank you, Brother Lacy. I have another question, and this question is from Deborah. Hi, Deborah. I think she's calling in from Germany. Her question is, yeah, and I have a follow-up question for you too, Brother Lacy. Hopefully I can remember it by then. Are there examples of the Credible Messengers program specifically engaging youth involved in foster care who may often feel isolated from their community?
That's a great question. It's so funny, we're CM3, we're working in LA right now. we're going through, some struggles, but are going to get there to get inside the probation department who runs detention facilities and what have you. Meanwhile, the child welfare system in LA County reached out because they had some crises and issues to get credible messengers inside of their residential settings. And we're actually doing a training tomorrow with credible messengers to begin to get them inside of, and with staff of the child welfare homes, to get them inside of the residences, which is a step, which is, I think, an important step, and certainly analogous to credible messengers inside of a detention center, that we infuse credible messenger perspective and experience, right, into the mix. But we continue to aspire not just to get access to these places, but to create, and again, transformative idea about child welfare itself, right? It needs it just as much as the quote unquote juvenile justice, right? To create what we're calling healing homes, temporary residences, but that are guided by credible messengers and community folks, that are not places where we temporarily hide away kids until we can figure something else out, but community resourced hubs that are intentional about loving young people, caring for them, and getting them reconnected in a healthy way to their family. So yeah, that, long story short, yes, that's beginning. And it speaks to, last thing I'll say is this wider array of credible messenger work, right? So James Bell talks about fractured communities. So by default, people end up in justice systems because they've been failed by healthcare, education, housing, right? Child welfare. But all of those systems need a healing and need to come together with a coherent approach. And we believe that the community perspective and credible messenger leadership can be and needs to be infused into the fracture of systems that ultimately are all about how the village cares for our young people holistically.
Thank you, Brother Lacy. I've got a couple more questions. This is a question that I have, and Reverend Dr. Denise Struthers and I were thinking along the same lines. She made a comment. I think it would be a great thing to bring young people to platforms like this one, ask them questions and answer any questions they may have. And bringing young people to it is definitely doable, but it presents a lot of challenges in and of itself. I work with young people all the time, and they are so used to the technology. Sometimes they won't even turn on their cameras, but sometimes they are listening, right? But that's a very great point. And to that point, Brother Lacy, I'm curious to know, how does at least from your experience, how do the credible messenger models that you've implemented include the voices and perspectives of justice and or legal involved young people that you serve through these programs? Like, are they ever included in the planning conversations or in the maybe policy reform work, and even conversations around language? Like, maybe they've said we don't want to be referred to as juveniles, or, like that kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. In terms of informing even throughout the continuum, including, what came to mind was the training work that we do with credible messengers, right? And so a young person system involved young person has wrote and talked about the fact that I am not my trauma. So trauma-informed work is great. Let's be informed, let's understand it, but that's not who I am. That's what happened. That's one of the things that happened. But I'm more than that, right? Like, out of the mouth of young people saying things like that, to say, okay, so yeah, let's understand the trauma, but are we truly healing centered? Are we truly strength-based? Are we not just asking, hey, what happened to you? What's wrong? Are we, which is better than saying, what'd you do wrong? And here's how we're gonna punish you. But we're not just saying what happened, we're saying, oh, what are your dreams? Oh, what do you want to do? What did you want to do when you were 7 years old? How do we recapture your dreams, right? So this is coming out of the mouths of young people, right? And informing us. Another example of it, and something that Ruben could talk about, is, and which we still want to build, is, but it's happening organically, is in the group sessions with credible messengers and young people. that are facilitated by credible messengers. Young people participate, and credible messengers are encouraged and trained to support young people to develop the lesson plans for the session. What are we going to talk about and deal with, and how are we going to do that, right? What is this time together going to look like, right? So really listening and taking the lead of young people from the most practical things of time together to larger policy questions. I have a conversation with a youth, I forgot the exact name of it, youth policy forum coming up. I'll get the name right in a minute, but of young people building and thinking about and advancing policy positions. So that's definitely not happening enough, but that's the direction we have to continue to go, right? Is to take the lead from young people and then be there as guides, as supporters to advance what our youth can teach us.
Thank you. And I see my dear friend Serena in the comments says, that's us, AYPF, American Youth Policy Forum.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry about that.
I'm not sure if you're aware of the American Youth Policy Forum. It's a nonprofit in DC, Brother Lacey, but that would be another great group to connect with, because it is young people, teenagers or young adults who literally are being educated about, different major issues in our society, and they're brainstorming and learning how to, make changes, especially as it relates to public policy. So if you're not already connected, I'd be willing to connect you guys.
We are, and actually your name came up. You're gonna be speaking with them, yeah, so.
Oh, you're coming, great. Yes, look at that, it's a small world after all. Okay, everyone, I'm running my mouth, but we got one more question for you, Brother Lacey, and then you're out of the hot seat and we'll take a break. So Reverend Austria has asked, I know that so many of the credible messengers who serve youth are, are people of faith, but how about churches and other faith-based groups? In DC, what did you see in terms of engagement from churches, mosques, and other faith-based organizations and entities?
Quite powerful and prominent in the work here. DC is an interesting place in a lot of ways. Every place is unique. A lot of DC doesn't have a state prison. All adults who go to prison go to federal prison, which creates an own issue with particularly DC, people incarcerated from DC. I was connecting that to the prevalence or a pretty strong current of Islam within brothers. It's in prison in general, but Christianity is also prevalent in prison as well. But a lot of brothers coming home who have converted to Islam, and then it begins to sort of connect to or influence some of the younger brothers who were in the justice process here. So Islam is quite prominent, but Christianity is as well. And so what we have is some of our provider organizations who have the contracts, who are funded to do credible messenger work, to hire and support credible messengers, are led by faith leaders, absolutely, and work out of their churches, literally, right? And work with, needless to say, with young people of various faiths, be it Islam or Christianity, predominantly those two. And so it's definitely a very strong part of the work here in DC. And as I said, faith organizations actually doing the work and leading the work. I think that it is continues to be obviously such a rich opportunity that we need to continue to grow, right? And continue to connect the dots. But it's definitely happening. So we're going to continue to do that. And there's some awesome faith leaders here who get it, who are credible messengers themselves in the sense that we've described it, and who are doing amazing work to grow this movement.
Thank you so much, Brother Lacey. We could give him all, and also Reverend Austria, give them a virtual round of applause.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much for engaging in this conversation and the discussions thus far. We're going to take a brief break now, so you can take a bio break. If you need to grab a snack, water, protein shake, and come back at 12:40 and for our panel. We'll see you shortly. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. I have I got a couple things going on, but I'm gonna keep it on and watch it and stay tuned as much as I can throughout the rest of the conversation. So I'm really excited to hear my brothers and my sisters. Bishop.
Clinton, it's good to see you, my brother.
You look great, man. It's so good to see you.
So do you, man. You and Ruben, man. I remember none of us had gray in our beard, and I actually had hair.
Yeah. Remember that?
Yeah, I remember that well, man. It's so glad to see you. I was trying to when I was doing when I was working for the Raise the Age program up here, I was trying to link up with you, just couldn't make it happen. But
right.
But good to see you.
Yeah, likewise. I'm glad we're definitely connected now. So I got all your information. So
yes, sir.
Yeah.
Yes, sir. And we do for another breakfast or something, Ruben. I got to come over and make a trip over to the Bronx and get some of that good breakfast you got me before, man. That place was good.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, man. It's awesome to see all of this happening, man. And just even looking at the Credible Messenger website, just seeing T. Haywood all over that website and just remembering all of the genesis of a lot of this work. A lot of this was conversations, man. Just sitting around, conversation, building, thinking, planning, praying, crying.
Yes, sir.
So to see where it is now, man, this is just incredible.
Yeah, man. Thank you. Yeah, T. Hayward, he's awesome.
Yeah, still is, and he's still on the front lines, man. T is still doing what he does, and he doesn't want to do anything else. It's one of the things I love about him. He doesn't want to be in administration. He doesn't want to be
right.
He wants to do the work, man, and he's still doing it.
He's awesome. That's great.
Yeah, he has a true servant's heart. He's been working on formalizing some of his curriculum, and I was telling him, look, man, you just make sure you have it in a way that you right, like you got your stuff copyrighted, and other people can't just take it and appropriate it. He's like, and I was like, have you thought about what kind of financial thing you might want? He's like, I just want whoever's going to use it the right way to have it.
Yeah, that's key, man. And I've had that conversation with him over the years too, man. I said, man, listen, you can't let people keep. He said, man, I don't care. I don't want to make no money off of this. I just want to see it done. So what do you say to somebody like that, except God bless you?
What we had him do, which was amazing, was when the Arches program was starting out, and there was maybe, man, I think even in the Bronx, there was like 7 organizations. We had a good probably 40 or so credible messengers, for the Bronx programs. And we had T just do like a full day team building thing between probation officers and the credible messengers.
I remember that.
And what was amazing, and we did it really to build teamwork, right? Like we were like, we gotta, we gotta get people on the same team who, are probation officers and people who used to be on probation, right? Or some who still are. The amazing thing about it was that the testimony that came out of it from the probation officers was like, this is the first time I really felt like I got to like bond with my coworkers, that I became a team with even my fellow probation officers. And kind of like, when are we going to do that again? Because we got to really be human in this time.
Yeah, man. That's and just seeing, even I did some work when I was with Osborne. I was doing some stuff, going out to some of the neon sites and doing workshops and stuff. And that was just incredible to see. And then, there's people calling me to ask me to come to speak at different Arches sites, and just seeing all the work that was going on in all those different places, man, was just amazing. So now I'm over here in Jersey, man, and we're I got when they appointed me as reentry coordinator for the city of Orange, one of the things that I told them was that I'm not going to do the back end work unless you allow me to do the front end work. And the front end work is mentoring, rites of passage, incredible messaging. So they said, fine. So I've started in Orange High School, just kind of going to the school and getting the feel for the school and the feel for the students. And we've been interrupted a couple of times by COVID right now, but when we get back at it, we're gonna create some after school programs, some mentoring programs and stuff to be able to work with the kids in Orange and hopefully be able to replicate it, because we got a bunch of little cities around Orange. Newark is right there. We have East Orange, Orange, West Orange, Irvington, all of those cities, and all of those are in need of credible messengering, reentry, and all of that stuff. And the great thing is doing it through the police department, because the police director is making it a public safety issue, as opposed to just something that's done, you know, by probation and stuff. He sees it as a public safety issue and is investing time and resources into it. So,
Wow, that's great, man. I'm definitely gonna follow up with you, man. I'd love to talk and learn more about that and connect the dots, you know?
yeah, I got to get you over to meet the police director and the mayor, because I've been talking about you.
Okay, absolutely, man. I'll be happy to come, man. Anything you ask, man.
Yeah, get all of y'all up there, because you know, I had some folk come up. The guy who's doing the therapeutic therapeutic crisis intervention for Graham, I had him come over to really talk about, and we're talking about even how we respond to mental health calls. All of that is
Right.
part of the movement, you know, how we respond to youth and changing the language, you know, working with the police department to change the language they're using and not using juvenile offenders and calling them children and calling them youth.
Right.
As opposed to calling them juveniles or offenders or whatever, and just really seeing how that's starting to move the rudder slowly on the mindset of how policing is done. So,
Absolutely. Wow, that's powerful. That's great.
yeah, man. So yeah, I listen. I drop you guys' names all the time, and had them.
Yeah.
I had the folks in Orange Google y'all, and it was like, oh man, oh this dude, oh for real, wow.
The Google.
Yeah,
Bishop,
yeah.
Are you
Magic Google.
connected? Are you connected to Reverend Angelita Clifton?
Yeah. Yeah, as a
Okay.
matter of fact, before the pandemic hit, I was going into Northern facility to do workshops for her.
Okay, good. Yeah, they have a whole they have a whole plan to really try to engage. I know they want to engage churches throughout Jersey to do what they're doing. I'm not sure where they're at with it, but like I love their vision. I know they're doing it in that first facility, but they want to set up a whole thing statewide with churches and credible messengers.
Yeah, I'm working on making the great thing about the episcopacy is being able to make my foray into a lot of the Kojic churches and the churches who are really just saying, no, we don't need to work on justice. Let's just preach the gospel. The gospel is justice in and of itself. And really showing them, you know, through scripture that this is the work that we need to be doing. And the investment in the work is not so much saying that you have to change the world, but you have to be just open your doors sometimes to get the ball rolling. So yeah, so I'm planning something big when the pandemic is over. So when I do, I'll definitely be planning to get you guys in. Now that I got Clinton's real phone number, I still had I had a 347 number. I had a 917 number for you. I had numbers for like, this ain't no Clinton, man. Don't call my phone no more. You're muted.
Hey, you guys. Hey, I'm so sorry to disturb.
That's all right.
It's a family reunion today, so I'm glad everybody's being able to catch up and touch base. Welcome back, welcome back, welcome back. One moment here. Sorry. Okay, so I'm really excited for this panel, if you can't tell already. I am going to introduce our three panelists. And we will get started. For time's sake, Reverend Ruben Austria is one of our panelists, and I read his bio earlier in the introduction. So if you need a refresher, please refer to the bio sheet that Katie sent in the email. But otherwise, I'm going to introduce Bishop Darren Ferguson and Ileana Pujos, who have joined us on the line. Hi, Ileana. Good to see you, girl. and then we'll jump into the Q&A. Bishop Darren Ferguson is the 7th pastor in the 103-year history of Bethel Baptist Church in Orange, New Jersey. He has served as the reentry coordinator for the city and has provided both services for returning citizens, as well as created both credible messenger and rites of passage programs for the city since 2020. Bishop Ferguson serves on the advisory council for the Credible Messenger Justice Center, and he is also the national director of public relations for the nonprofit Healing Communities USA, which is run by our dear friend and one of my mentors and was one of my professors at Howard University School of Divinity, Dr. Harold Chulier. Darren A. Ferguson is known as a leader for this generation and multiple generations, I may add, a preacher, teacher, singer, motivational speaker, and social activist. Ileana Pujos is the policy director of the Connecticut Justice Alliance. She is a 2017-2019 Youth First Initiatives Youth Leader Network alumna, a 2019 CT Connecticut Public Allies alumna, and a 2019-2021 Annie E. Casey Foundation Youth Advisory Council alumna. So shout out to Leanne and Opal and Steve at the Annie E. Casey Foundation. And she currently serves as a member of the 2021 World Congress on Justice with Children, Child and Youth Advisory Group. She is a frequent panelist for national organizations, speaking to her expertise around youth and young adult partnership and advocacy based on her personal experiences and professional success. And again, Reverend Oster is the founding executive director of Community Connections for Youth. All right, can we pull up our panel? Is it possible to spotlight?
We're all spotlighted.
Oh, we are? You know what? That's probably me. Oh, okay. There we are. Thank you so much. We will also have, depending on our time, have a time slot also towards the end of the panel, maybe 10 or 15 minutes for Q&A. So once again, if you have questions, things that bubble up, please feel free to put them in the chat and continue the wonderful conversations that are happening in the chat. So for each and every one of you, let's start off. What brings you to this conversation today? What was your introduction to Credible Messenger mentoring, and how did you first get involved? Ileana, would you like to kick us off?
So thank you. Yeah, I think so. I now am 24, started this work when I was 19. I'm based in Connecticut. I started with the Connecticut Justice Alliance when they first started their youth adult partnership model. And I think it took me about 1.5 years to even be introduced to the concept of what a credible messenger was. And as I kind of learned more about the model, how credible messengers work, it kind of made me realize that I, in my childhood, had a credible messenger that wasn't necessarily an official credible messenger, right? And the impact of what those kind of roles do for young people, specifically those in the system. So I think that once I got introduced to the concept, it's been something I've been running with and talking about in all these different places, acting like I know everything about it. But for the most part, I mean, I had somebody recently tell me credible messengers isn't the silver bullet. And ever since then, I think of it as the silver bullet, because no matter what problem we talk about, when we talk about young people, the impact of somebody like a credible messenger in their life can do so much and get you so far. So I think that's kind of how I got involved with it. And since then have kind of been attached to the idea of credible messengers in multiple spaces. So.
Thank you, Ileana. Bishop Ferguson, what brings you to the conversation today?
Oh, wow. Just hearing her say she's 24 made my heart hurt. I started this work, actually, the first time that we really had any conversations about credible messengering was while I was incarcerated. And on Christmas, I believe it was 1994, a young man was killed in the prison. And we had to, and we instituted, myself, T. Haywood, some other guys instituted something called the 60 Days of Peace. And what we did was we went to the leaders of all of the groups, formal and informal groups within the prison. The early Bloods and Crips, Latin Kings, Nietas, NAACP, Christians, Muslims, so forth. They said that we wanted 60 days of peace, which meant that any conflicts had to be resolved. If it had to go to violence, it had to be fists and not weapons. And it almost got us all transferred out of the jail because it was like one of those, that's too much power for people to have. And that kind of gave us was the genesis, for me at least, of how powerful it was that people who are in your circle, who are like-minded, who have similar experiences, how powerful that influence is with each other. Moving on to when I was released, I became a facilitator for a program called Youth Turn through NYTS, where they sent 10 men who had been in the prison to do gang outreach in 10 communities. And in that work is where I met Ruben, and continued my work with T. Haywood, and met Dr. Alfonso White, who I met in prison, and Dr. Trulier, and kind of seeing all of those things, all of those ideas from the 7 communities of Eddie Ellis to the work that Ruben was doing. I remember Ruben first started the work. He looked like a little kid, in the Bronx. Looked like he was one of the youth himself. And to see the great work that he's done over the years and all the contributions that he had and how many lives he's changed over the years, to now where I see it as something that has been codified in some ways because of the work that's been done in bringing it to communities, but also it still needs to be further implemented in all communities, because so my work in this has kind of been from the genesis, and I'm hoping to continue to see the revelation of it.
Thank you, Bishop Ferguson. Reverend Austria?
Yeah, so at first it's great to see you, Bishop. Consider you a mentor and a big brother. It's great to see you, Ileana. We got to not co-present in the same panel, but got to see Ileana present at a event in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and just really glad to see young women especially stepping up. Even though I talked about the boys being targeted, girls and young women of color are the fastest growing demographic in the justice system. And just really appreciate you for speaking truth to power, and just know from Hernan and others the work that you're doing to get young people involved in policy change and really in that leadership role. So it's great to be with both of you. I would say for me, my introduction to credible messengers, first, not using that term, but first in the churches, my first job was to go out and recruit mentors from churches for young people. And I had a very difficult experience in the Bronx with a lot of churches just a lot of people in the church, they were too busy. They were in Bible study on Thursday, and they were choir rehearsal on Tuesday, and prayer fellowship on Wednesday, and men's ministry. It was just, and so, going calling for mentors and trying to get people to volunteer. And there would always be certain people who they'd kind of like come, quietly afterwards and be like, listen, I want to do this, but, I got to ask you a question. I got a background, can I still do this? And it was like, wow, you're exactly who we're looking for. And there were so many men and women in the churches who had been incarcerated and who wanted to serve. And then honestly, my experience with it as well was also seeing how really it was the credible messengers who could go way beyond my limitations, right? That for myself, I did 6 years upstate, but it was in college. I didn't grow up in the South Bronx. I grew up on the west side of Manhattan. I grew up near the projects, but not in the projects. But just for me, there was so many privileges and so many ways that my life was so different from the lived experience of young people. And I could care about them. I could advocate for them. I could support them. But there was a certain place that I couldn't go just because I didn't necessarily have the experience to tell a young person how to disconnect from a gang, or how to, right, there were certain things that were just, it was like, man, I can't, I need others to do this. And I would see that those who were formerly incarcerated, those who had been in gangs, those who had been involved in the system, definitely just had a special ability to connect with young people who wouldn't trust anybody else. And so pretty quickly, credible messengers, even though we weren't calling them as such, became kind of the core of our mentors. And then as time would go on, and I got introduced to like the writings and teachings of Eddie Ellis, and kind of his specific language, where he talked, and Bishop Ferguson could probably talk much more about this from having spent much more time with Eddie in person. But I remember Eddie and also Dr. Divine Pryor talking about being incarcerated, seeing a younger generation come into prison, and almost saying, what is with, like, we're almost scared of these young brothers, that they have like no, like, what's their code, right? And they're so disconnected, they're so alienated. And hearing them tell the story, saying, when we get out of here, when we're released, we have to go back to our neighborhoods, and because we're the only ones who can be credible messengers to these young people. And so I've just been then, as Clinton Lacey and others have sort of taken that and turned that into policy. My role, I've been honored to be able to play a role in just supporting credible messengers, developing trainings, coachings, but really just uplifting that group of people who, I say are just really they are the hope for young people that nobody else can reach.
Thank you, Reverend Oster. And you've sort of answered this question in a way. I'll still pose it, and then Bishop Ferguson, Ileana, if you have things to add on or build on to it, please definitely jump in. Reverend Oster, in your experience, what makes a credible messenger so effective in working with young people? Where does a credible messenger get their credibility from with a young person or people? And how do organizations identify this trait? Is it personality? Is it street cred?
Yeah, so I mean, that's a question I get asked all the time. And a lot of times I get asked by organizations that are thinking, well, we want to hire credible messengers. How do we know who's credible? How do we screen? How do we? And I would say really the answer, right, is that like it is young people in the community who give credible messengers their credibility, right? Who say, this is somebody that I trust, right? Somebody I care about. You could have the street cred, you could have the record, and you cannot be credible to young people because you don't care about them, right? Or because you don't practice what you preach. And I think Clinton Lacey likes to talk about, I see her talk about it a lot, that even when he ran a system in DC, kind of saying, how do even us in the system, how do we become credible messengers to young people? And I think ultimately what makes a messenger credible, right, is love and integrity, and that young people and everybody else around them can see that this person is really working from a place of love and a place to support a young people's best interests. I think that, and people then also often ask, right, how do you find credible messengers? How do you get them? And one of the unfortunate things I think that happened in New York at a certain point in time, right, when Clinton talked about that Arches initiative, which really was amazing, there was kind of two groups of organizations that got those contracts. And one was kind of your historically big social service agencies that have, had contracts forever, and they do group homes and they do everything, right? And the other was grassroots organizations, often run by credible messengers or started by credible messengers. The big organizations had trouble with the hiring because they just sort of followed traditional hiring practices. So somebody came in and said, look, I've been locked up like this, and they had the gift of gab, oh, you're great. And then they struggle, right? And sometimes the character wasn't there, or just sometimes it wasn't a good fit. What to me was so beautiful about the grassroots organizations and people like Julio Medina at Exodus and just other folks is that there was, and Darren could speak much more about this, but there was a whole tradition of mentoring inside of the prison system that folks were already a part of. And so I think of somebody, Darren, you might know him too, a brother, Julius Walker, who he came home and, he got it, and he was on parole and he got employed as a mentor, maybe like, 2 weeks after getting out, right? And in the mainstream, that would be like, wait, isn't that way too soon? But when Julius came out, there was all these other people who said, well, he mentored me in prison, right? He's the one who taught me how to transform my life. And so I think really whenever I You know, whenever people say, well, how do you know who's credible? It's saying, well, we'll look at, you know, who mentored them and who are they mentoring, and who, you know, who can kind of testify to their character and their life in all circumstances, not just in a job position or in a volunteer position. And then the last thing I'll say, you know, again, is just that I think we're all called to be credible messengers to young people by loving them and supporting them. And whether you work in a system, whether you have lived experience, you can become credible even if you don't share the lived experience by being a person who genuinely loves and lifts up and supports young people.
Thank you so much. Do either of you have something to add, or?
Ileana, I'll defer to you because I see it bubbling on the surface.
You're good. You're unmuted. I'll follow up.
Well, yeah, I think Ruben is exactly right. You know, one of the things in initially starting Exodus Transitional Community back in 1999, one of the things that we always said was we looked at, you know, that network that we had inside the prison was very tight, and you knew who was good and who wasn't. You knew who was faking the funk and who wasn't. You knew who really had the integrity. So we used that network to kind of build. And I think that network still exists in a lot of ways. So the idea of credible messengering is, I think the basis of it is what Ruben said, it's love, right? I remember, you know, starting out with the youth term program, and I remember C. Vernon Mason saying to me, say, young people don't care what you know, they just want to know that you care. And I think the basis of that is finding somebody who's loving, caring, nurturing, who wants to do the work, who earnestly wants to work, and then has the added components of, you know, maybe some of the education and things like that. But ultimately, it's love that's the determining factor in what makes somebody a good, credible messenger or not.
Yeah, I was just going to follow up and add that I think, and a lot of what Ruben said, right, ties back to the challenges of it too, because when we talk about a credible messenger and what may come attached with that in terms of criminal history or any other regular boundary that would prevent you from getting a job, systems people often get mad that or push back on the idea of this model because of that reason, right? And it's, if you want a credible messenger, you also have to acknowledge that challenge that's going to come with employing one, and how you have to shift to a different culture when it comes to what the requirements should be around people who are essentially dealing with young people, right? So I think that's been was just one of the things that stood out to me as you guys were both speaking, because it's a bittersweet thing, right? They all want to know, what do you have? I want a credible messenger. I want a credible messenger. And then when it comes time to hire one, they're like, but can I get one who's been out for 5 years or 2 years, or, you know, and then it's that meddles with the whole concept.
Wow, thank you so much. Ileana, as we heard in Mr. Lacey's presentation, credible messenger mentoring, and I know that it's not, that terminology is not always used, but, you know, just like the theology and the ideology of it has been adopted by several cities, including New York and Washington, D.C., and even in Connecticut, where you are, as formal diversion programs. In localities or probation offices that have not yet recognized credible messenger mentoring, what steps do you think are needed to translate this practice into policy? And I know that you've been working on this. Who are the key stakeholders, and what should advocates meet with to champion this practice?
So it's absolutely different state to state, right? Even Connecticut, from the time that I've been with the Alliance, I just seen my first request for proposal come out of the judicial branch for a credible messenger program just recently, this last quarter of the previous year, right? And I think every state might tackle adopting the model different, whether you're trying to get it passed through legislation, or if you're just trying to, again, go through the process of like applying for an RFP for a program, or right, to provide a service. I think that it's important to start with community, right? And I think the only way that I can kind of share what I'm trying to say is through an example. We kind of, at the Alliance, we hold division sessions, and what that is really just transparent community conversations, right? And meeting with kids that are in the system, or families in the community, parents, whatever it may be, and having conversations about where those gaps are. When you start to have those conversations, kids start to tell you exactly what they want. Right. And once you have community buy-in and understanding of what they need, you then go to get legislative buy-in, right? Or whoever your target may be. We've kind of, over the years, I mean, we've done vision sessions at the end of 2017, and in every session we've been in, we've heard kids describe exactly what a credible messenger is, right? When we talk about solutions or people who could guide them on a positive path, it's not a system, right? It's somebody that reflects the role of a credible messenger. So I think the steps will definitely look different state to state, but I would definitely always start in community. I mean, just knowing exactly what your community wants, where the gaps are, you need to know those things in order to be able to fill them, right? And then I think in terms of advocates meeting with champions, I can just speak on behalf of our own advocacy. I mean, we work very closely with our legislative champions. We've been advocating for credible messengers till our face turned blue. Since I've came on board, it's not a concept that they heard for the first time coming from our end. I think just always continuing that advocacy, right? And sometimes we find ourselves in spaces talking about credible messengers where a kid might not even know what that is, right? So it's also educating as you operate, right? Everywhere we go, if somebody doesn't know what a credible messenger is, we're quick to explain it, right? Sometimes people don't even know these kinds of solutions exist. So, I mean, educating is really, really important. And I think exposing people to what other options look like, such as credible messengers, is where you would have to start.
Thank you so much, Ileana, for that. Reverend Austria, you lead a nonprofit, Community Connections for Youth, which equips grassroots, faith, and neighborhood organizations to develop effective community-driven alternatives to incarceration for youth. Part of your work includes partnering with these local organizations on things like trainings for credible messenger mentors. Can you share more about that work and why you think it's so important to engage the faith community? And Bishop Ferguson, I know you've done the same and continue to do over the years. So if you have an add-on, please definitely jump in.
Yeah, so thank you for that question. And I think the reason why it is so important to engage communities as a whole, and also specifically the faith community, is just that, right, we are still coming out of an epidemic of incarceration, right? That a few years ago, there was a study that found that if incarceration continued at the current rates, that a Latino boy born today would have a 1 in 6 chance of being incarcerated, and an African-American boy a 1 in 3 chance. And again, while girls were still statistically much less likely, they were the fastest growing. And when I think about those numbers, right, we went through a period of time as a society of becoming so dependent on the criminal justice system to throw at every single community problem, that to undo that is going to take so much more than just juvenile justice reform. It's going to take so much more than just specialized alternative to incarceration programs. To me, it's something that it's really got to take everybody, right? And yes, there are going to, and this is what I struggle with, because I lead a nonprofit organization, right? And I know we do excellent work as a nonprofit organization, but we don't do a fraction of the work that needs to be done to overturn the incarceration epidemic, right? And even if you were to reform all of this, even if you were to close all the youth prisons and stop sending any young person into the system, young people would still be living in communities where their schools don't care about them, where schools are pushing them out, where they're facing challenges in the streets. And so there's a whole community infrastructure that needs to be in place really to fill the void that has been left by policy decisions, right, that have gone on for generations, that have said, all we're going to do is throw the system at young people and their issues and challenges. And so our specific role is like, yes, we want to be really good in our neighborhood at doing the alternatives to incarceration. Did I freeze first? I saw it for, okay.
We can hear you.
Okay, yeah, but so we want to be really good at what we're doing, but we have to do it in collaboration with other organizations, because no one organization can do this by ourselves. Furthermore, part of our mission, again, is just really to try to equip anybody and everybody to do this work, because it is going to take everybody. The reason why churches, to me, and faith-based organizations are really important, one is just because they're there, right? Like you go into any high incarceration community and you're going to see a high number, right? Like you may see 6 storefronts on a block, right? And what I come back to, and maybe this is just old school purist way of thinking, but it's like, man, if every single church or faith-based organization was engaging young people the right way on their block, right? Like we probably could put the justice system out of business. And a church has a whole lot of work to do to engage young people the right way, because we would serve young people all the time, and some of them might say, oh yeah, I want to go to church. And we say, here's a good church you could go to. And they go, and we say, how'd you like it? And they say, I don't know. I walked in, they said, take off your hat, pull your pants up. And, you know, I just didn't really feel like I belonged there. And young people would actually say to us, well, why can't this just be my church? And we're going, man, we're not a church, and yet we sort of are a church. But I say the churches are important is because I think what young people also really need is to be connected, right, to a caring community. And with the church, you kind of have that built in a lot of ways, right? You have a caring community if it's functioning the right way. And also, the church is important because in a lot of the communities that we talk about that are over incarcerated or over justice involved, the church or the faith-based organization might be the only kind of independent, people of color-led institution that's there, right? And the sad thing is that a lot of times the organizations that provide specialized services, right, good services, but they're not necessarily in and of the community. They're not necessarily accountable to the community. The staff don't necessarily live there. In a project that I was first involved in, through which, you know, I met a lot of the folks here, Reverend Trullier, they talked about churches with high resident membership as being the ones who are the most effective at reaching young people. So they said it's not the big commuter churches, it's not the ones where people drive in and park on the street and then drive back out to the suburbs, but it's the ones where a lot of people live right in the neighborhood, right? And that idea of that again, that you're creating the village, like Clinton said, you want young people to be walking around and having a whole bunch of people in the neighborhood saying, hey, how you doing? What's going on? How's school? Why aren't you in school? You know, what do you need? And I think in a lot of ways we've lost that, right? Where again, the fear of young people has made a whole bunch of us just, like even a lot of social service providers, a lot of youth development agencies go, well, we could work with the good kids, but those kids who are in gangs, those kids who are getting arrested, that they need something, you know, that's the job for probation, or that's the job for the specialized programs. And though I don't want to minimize the importance of that, right, and the importance of the credible messenger as kind of that frontline person who's really going to get the young person, I don't think churches, right, or any organization should get off the hook for engaging young people the right way, right? And so even if the credible messenger is the front line who's going to be able to connect to them and bring them in, there's a whole bunch of community needs that are just needed, right? And so I think about a church, it's funny, I think, Darren, you used to be the youth pastor there, right? But I think about a church in the South Bronx, the Mott Haven Reformed Church, right, which has always engaged with us. Their church as their membership right now doesn't have a whole lot of people who are great mentors for young people in the justice system, right? Just because it's an older demographic. It's not necessary. The membership is not necessarily people who naturally connect with young people. But the pastor there now, Reverend Patricia Seeley, just has such a heart for this work. And she actually started a ministry really to support the families of incarcerated youth, or sorry, families of incarcerated parents. And if you know the work, you know that like that's not two separate groups of people, right? It's not like, oh, there's kids with incarcerated parents and there's, you know, kids who are incarcerated. It's often the same families, right? And so they have, while they might not necessarily be on the front lines of having credible messengers engage young people, they're absolutely on the front lines of having the whole church engage families, support children with incarcerated parents. And I think that's just sort of the building work that needs to happen, right? That not everybody's supposed to turn into a specialized alternative to incarceration program, but everybody should be engaged in the work of how do we keep the children who are in our own neighborhood, right, from being swallowed by the beast. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Reverend Austria. Bishop Ferguson, what I'll do, I have a question for you, so we can kind of merge into this question. Bishop Ferguson, drawing on your experience as a pastor, but also as someone who has helped to implement credible messenger mentoring at your city level, and training people across the country, can you share with fellow clergy or church members recommendations or advice for beginning this work? How can churches and faith leaders get involved in credible messenger mentoring, either as mentors or local advocates? And then the question, why is it so important to engage the faith community?
That's a great question, Yasmin, and one that I've been seeking to answer in a lot of ways over years. And every community is different, every church is different, every city is different. Like Ileana said, things in Connecticut are much different. I'm finding out things are way different in New Jersey. I'm a New York transplant, so really learning the lay of the land in New Jersey is much different than New York. And what I'm realizing is one of the things that Dr. Trelier taught me. He and I were in Ohio, and he was preaching one Sunday morning. And the pastor told us before the service that, my church doesn't have an incarceration problem. And, Dr. Trelier got up and did his thing. And at the end of the service, he said, everyone who has someone here who's in the criminal justice system, be it your son, your daughter, your father, uncle, stand up. And 80% of the church stood up. And the pastor stood there flabbergasted, like, oh, so. The first thing I think is getting churches to work within, because a lot of churches, whether the pastors know it or not, the work is already being done right there within the church, because somebody has a son who's incarcerated, a daughter who's incarcerated, a kid who's been in trouble, or a kid who's run into problems with the school system. So if the pastor would just do some in-reach and find out the work that's already been going on, then you'd be able to work your way out to be able to do work on a community level. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that I think that the attitude of the church has been less than stellar, I'll put it that way, in terms of how we respond to the problem of incarceration and the problem of our youth. And unfortunately, the problem that we're having in a lot of our churches is that we want youth ministry to look like it did when we were kids. I'm 58 years old, and I didn't go to church when I was a kid. So I don't know what youth ministry looked like when I was a kid. One. Two, the youth ministry that I was doing at Abyssinian 20 years ago is much different than the youth ministry that has to happen now. So what I'm doing now is, as opposed to trying to apply my 58 years old when Jay-Z and Will Smith were young sensibilities to youth ministry now, I'm deferring to people like Ileana who are young and brash and understand it because they're still close enough to it to understand what's going on. So I just asked two young people in my church to head the youth ministry. Neither one of them, I think both of them are 20 and 21, and did it in a way so that they can start building, because they were able to tell me all the stuff that's going on with our kids that I didn't even know. Right? Because the kids aren't going to come and tell me that I'm failing 4 classes, or that I had a pregnancy scare, or that I got in trouble for smoking weed. The kids aren't going to tell me that, the parents are going to tell me that, but the other kids know. So doing that in-reach within the church is one way to get it done. And the other way is to just go around and raise awareness. One of the things that I've done as a pastor is I've realized that pastors respond to pastors. So a lot of times when somebody who comes in with no, we talk about street credibility, but no credible messengering within the church, pastors want to hear it from other pastors. What does this look like? What does this mean? What does this mean for my ministry? Who am I going to alienate? Who am I going to make mad? Because the political aspects of being a pastor often come into play with doing the work. So removing that by saying, listen, I'm a pastor, I'm formerly incarcerated, and being able to go in front of a church and say, I am the potential result of the work that we're asking you to do. Because if you pour into a young person, there's no telling where those young people are going to go. I know that Ruben can tell you of wonderful stories of people that he mentored 20 years ago and the fantastic work that they're doing today. And I'll close by this. I was asked in 2013 to do the invocation for the New York City Council for one of their city council meetings. So I went into the chambers and everything feeling like a big shot. And I'm sitting and I'm talking to one of the city council people. And for some reason we started talking about Sing Sing. And he said, yeah, I would never be here if I didn't go to Sing Sing and hear some guy telling his story about, how he got incarcerated and how God came into his life. And I realized the dude was talking about me. He had heard me speak at Sing Sing 20 something years ago, and he was looking at that as a springboard for the work that he's doing now. So what I say to people is, if you want to apply it to the religious community, one, you have to say, look at people and use those biblical principles. I tell folks that I'm asking you to sow seeds. I'm asking you to sow seeds of hope and promise and a bright future into our young people by simply doing the work. And a lot of times for the churches is getting out of the way so the work can be done.
Can I say something else about churches, just as far as where churches could play such a powerful role?
Please.
Yeah, so I mentioned it, I think in the opening, but we did an initiative a while back, right, where I just and what was funny was I had to really push the Legal Aid Society to do this. Yeah, and the Legal Aid Society, who represents young people in New York, I mean, they're wonderful, right? Because they are really vigorous defenders of their clients. But I told them I want to bring clergy in, like to meet young people and just to sit in on their court hearings, and they were very protective, right? Like, well, these are our kids, their privacy and whatnot. I said, but they're not your kids any more than they are the community's kids, right? But we did this amazing thing where we did some training, right, for clergy and people who are interested, but then we had them just come in and observe proceedings in the family court. And I will tell you that on the days that we had them come in and observe proceedings, I'd never seen the judges be so kind to young people. I'd never seen the prosecutors behave so well. It was like they changed the atmosphere in the courtroom, right, for young people to be shown more respect, right, just because somebody was paying attention, right, somebody was looking. And then what we actually got the Legal Aid Society to agree to was we said, look, where they actually brought up something, they said, we have a certain type of client, a certain type of young person who has no adult coming with them, right? No adult comes to court with them, right? There's just nobody, right? And somebody would say maybe it was that they're in foster care and they've been bouncing around. But we started to work towards something of saying, what could we have a clergy or just a lay volunteer, right? Somebody who would just volunteer to show up at young people's court dates and build a relationship. And I tell you that just that dynamic itself, when the courts just see that right, and they judges are supposed to consider something called community ties, but when they see that, again, it just starts to change the outlook of what's being presented from a young person. These are their crimes, these are their risk factors, right? And start to hear a personal relationship that somebody has. The second thing that I just want to say about the church, and it comes to advocacy, is that I do believe that politicians and policymakers, right, they do a calculation. They see 100 people who are asking for a change, and they see 100 voters. They see 100 clergy asking for a change, and they multiply that by 100 or so in thinking about how many people do these clergy represent. And again, I'll just share another quick story. There was a period of time that we had a youth coalition that had come together to fight the expansion of the detention centers in New York City. They wanted to put $60 million into the new juvenile detention centers to add like 200 more beds. And it was really youth leaders who just pushed back hard against that. But I also believe that one of the things that tipped it was an unrelated event. We had a pastor's prayer summit or a national day of prayer, something in the Bronx, right? And we had about maybe 70 churches, and over 1,000 people came together one night to pray. And I was working for another organization at this time that was helping to coordinate that. And I said, can we give out letters just for people to send in to their city council members and to the mayor, right? Just to say that like they oppose this thing being being expanded. And we got to make a really quick announcement, and people took the letters and they mailed them. Or I hope they mailed them in. But it was a couple weeks after that the city announced that they were abandoning the plans to expand the detention centers. Again, it also took young people disrupting city council meetings. It took protests in the street. It took all of that stuff. But I also think that when the clergy kind of showed up and said, we get behind this, some people in power made a political calculation to go, that's a lot of votes this is representing. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Bishop Ferguson and Reverend Austria for that. These are all great examples to help us better understand the importance and the role of faith and faith-based leaders and all of us and the various roles that we can play in supporting young people and helping to, support them and for lack of a better term, kind of deliver them from cycles and systems that they may find themselves in. Ileana, much of your work is devoted to equipping young advocates. Can you share why it's so important to partner with young people themselves as leaders in the credible messenger mentoring space and in policy reform?
Yeah, so I think it was Bishop Ferguson that said, pastors listen to pastors. And when I thought of this question, the same thing, right? Young people listen to young people, and what it looks like to have somebody who reflects you, looks like you, comes from the same place as you, guiding you in a different path or on a path you would like to be on, or whatever it may be, right? There's no bigger impact than that. I think when it comes to young people, my people's, younger people, older people, whatever it may be, right? Building that leadership capacity. I'll say that when I started this work, I was a part of the first group that, the first youth adult partnership group that CTJA had. And I was trying to recruit people. And I had hundreds of friends who have been in the system, right? I lived in the middle of New Haven, Connecticut. I knew everybody. I was in high school. It was the perfect time to recruit, but nobody knew anything about juvenile justice. And nobody knew or even felt the reason to want to be interested in policy work or any of this, right? And even if I dangled $25 an hour, it still wasn't enough buy-in, right? And I think just knowing that there's so many young people who don't even know about the issues that go on around them that impact them, that's bad, right? We want these young people to be able to impact things that impact them. And that's just the way that we think about it, is nothing about us without us, right? And that should be any system, whether we're talking about housing, criminal justice, food equity, whatever it may be. And I believe it was also Reverend Austria brought up the importance of cross collaboration. I could not stress this enough. It's not just a juvenile justice issue. When we talk about addressing youth crime, whatever it may be, we're talking about addressing housing insecurity, economic insecurity, poverty, right? Lack of equal education, lack of equal opportunities, all of those issues that are feeding kids into the system. So in order to find out where those gaps are and what those challenges are, we need to be working with young people. I always tell people who just don't understand me, like, it's like a business. When you have a store, the only way you know if your business is good, if your product is good, is if you get reviews. The only way we know what works and what doesn't work in the system is if we're asking those in the system. And I think it's just really important to make sure that not only are we starting youth adult partnerships and letting young people lead the way, but only if you're going to do it authentic. Because it's also another ball game when people just want to bring you on for a panel or for a project, or they just want to check off the box or meet with the young people and then meet with the adults to make the decision. There's a lot of non-authentic energy that goes into working with young people. So I would say don't even explore the route if you're not going to do it 100% authentically. Because there's also a lot that doesn't benefit the young person. Going through the phase of just understanding what your trauma is, how certain things have came up in your life that have impacted where you are now, unpacking all of that is a lot. Understanding how to share your story, not exploit yourself, all of those things that go into really helping a young person be a leader, shifting into a role such as a credible messenger, right? It's a lot to balance. So I probably wrap it up with that. But my point being that doing it is a lot more than just starting the partnership and paying them or filling the role or finding the right fit. There's a lot of give that you have to give to get. So.
Thank you. Yes, Ileana, thank you. Bishop Ferguson, what challenges come with or may come with adopting credible messenger mentor models and replicating it on a broader scale? I think each of you have mentioned at some point that every state is different, right? And cities that have their own personalities and their own way of doing things. How can those challenges potentially be overcome?
I have the unique perspective of being formerly incarcerated and having done different levels of credible messengering work, from the direct service work to being part of some of the think tanks that got us where we are today. So I have that unique perspective. So it's a little bit easier for me to usher my people through some of the concerns, because the concerns are various. So who are you bringing into our church? How do we know what they were locked up for? What did they do? What are they going to say to our kids? You know, all of those things. And that was the issue that was with me when Dr. Butts made me the youth minister at Abyssinian Baptist Church. When I came in from the youth turn program where I was doing outreach to gang members, and then I'm bringing these kids into church, and then the deacons are going, do you know where you are? Do you know what kind of language they're using? Did you hear what they just said? I said, yeah, I did hear exactly what they just said. And Dr. Butts having the presence of mind to move me from that role as an intern to his actual youth minister, realizing that there was a footprint that the church needed to have in the community that it did not have, and that somebody like me could give them footprint. Because what I did was Sunday morning, I was looking at the church, and I'm looking upstairs, we got this great sanctuary, and there's 2,000 something people up in the sanctuary, and the music is playing, and everybody's hands are raised, and I'm downstairs, and I'm looking, and there's 12 kids. There's 12 teenagers down there. And I'm saying those 3,000 something people have got to translate into more kids. So I asked for the kids, I said, where everybody at? And they said, they're in McDonald's up on 7th Avenue. So I literally walked out of the church up 7th Avenue in my robe, went into McDonald's, and I said there was a bunch of kids sitting there. I said, any of y'all that belong to Abyssinian Baptist Church, come with me. And all the kids going like this, they're looking, they're acting like they don't belong. And I said, look, if I bore you, you could come back here next Sunday. But if I keep your attention, then you come and hang out with me. And that was being a credible messenger in that moment, because the credible messengering wasn't so much my background or me being in the trenches with them, but it was so much that somebody saying, I care enough to come out of my comfort zone, to come where you are and say, I want you with me. I want to talk to you. I want to spend time with you. I want to not only talk to you, but I want to hear what you've gone through and what you've been through. And then watch it now, 40 years, 20 years later, these kids are now in their late 30s, some of them in their early 40s, and they're all upstanding members of the community. They all belong to churches, and they're the credible messengers for the ones coming right behind them. So it's incumbent upon us to understand that churches are going to have concerns, and people are going to have concerns about people who are formerly incarcerated because of what they've experienced, what they've gone through, what they've seen. Sometimes they've been victims of crimes themselves, and all of those are valid points or valid reasons to have concern. But I think it's a risk reward thing. The risk is that you bring somebody in your church who you may have some trepidation about, but the reward is that when you have the right people in place and you're undergirding it not only with the professional attitude of knowing who you're bringing in and being able to choose people wisely and having that level of discernment, but also undergirding it with the prayers of the church and undergirding it with the church saying that we're committed to this process. And attracting the authenticity of the church will attract the authentic people that we need in the community to actually do the work. I would love to have, people would say it's non-traditional, but I would have somebody like Ileana come and speak in my church on a Sunday morning. And I don't care if she has a theological degree. I don't care what she tells me she believes in. She believes in our young people. That gives her the credibility that she needs to stand in the pulpit on Sunday morning to say things to our people because ultimately our business is changing lives. Our business is making people better. Our business is putting people in a position to be better than they were, because we're not only going to do the work for them and to them, but we're also going to inspire them to do the work themselves. And that's what this work is all about. That's what credible messengering is all about. Saying, I've been there, I've done that, I got the t-shirt, I got the scarf to show you, but I'm also telling you that there's another way. And the other way is that I'm going to show you a way out. I'm going to show you a way up. I'm going to show you a way through, and I'm going to hold your hand through the process, and I'm going to be there with you through the whole process. And that's what I think we need to do more of, to put the humanity in all of this, to humanize those people who have been both harmed parties and responsible parties, to humanize the folks who are afraid of the possibility of bringing somebody formerly incarcerated into their church. And for me, it's just been seeing that your authenticity and your body of work will speak for you long distance. Because I was appointed by the mayor of Orange, New Jersey. Who would have thought that somebody like me would be appointed by a mayor to do the work that is my life's work, and gave me the leeway to do it in any way that I want to do it. And that's the important thing. That's where we are going to make the change that we want to see both in our communities and in our churches. Sorry, I got a little off subject there, but yeah.
No, you didn't. That was perfect. Ileana, I know you had something to add.
Yeah, because I seen a comment in the chat. I think one thing that I would love to see like more happen of, and again, I only speak on behalf of my experience in Connecticut, is I feel like there's a disconnect between young people and church. Because at least the way that I was always brought up, I seen church as a place where, like, if you're flawed, you don't go there. You only go to Sunday service. It's a drag. Like, it was never something that I felt like was a space that I would go to openly. When I was in high school, I used to go with my friend to like their youth services, and it was the best experience I had. But when I got kind of out of that phase, my mom always brought me just to Sunday service, right? And I think that there's a big disconnect with young people in church, because sometimes they see it as a space that they're not necessarily fit for, or isn't somewhere where they would regularly go. And I think it would be good for young people to have a faith-based space to be going back to. I think we've come a long way, like I'm old to be saying that, but we've come a way where, like, I feel like young people are just slowly moving away from faith-based practices and faith-based spaces. And it's not often that I see young people from my community in a church whenever I do go. And I think that that's very unfortunate, because that kind of space is where we need to get to. Right. It takes a village to raise a family. There's not a lot of spaces where you see that kind of energy happening. And yeah, it would just be interesting to explore how we kind of fill that gap between faith-based spaces and young people, and get more young people into spaces, and have more people like Reverend Austria and Bishop Ferguson in these kind of in churches and in spaces. Because at least in Connecticut, I don't see, it's off. My family switches up churches a lot, and I haven't met a lot of pastors or reverends or anyone that I've really connected with, or felt a purpose to return to, you know?
Yeah. If I could just add, you got me thinking, I just got to add to that, is that I think that it's so important for churches to get involved with young people in the justice system. But the church has to be willing to embrace young people in the justice system, even if they got absolutely no interest in going to church, right? Because and again, I come from a certain, I accepted Jesus into my heart at 16 years old, right? I gave my life to Christ. I was saved. I was taught to evangelize, to go bring people to the Lord. But once you kind of come at young people, making it a condition of like, I want to support you. I want you to be involved, but it's really my ultimate motive really is to get you in the church, is to get you saved, is to get you believing. That it doesn't work. It doesn't work. And not to say that I've not seen young people come to faith as a result of being served and supported, but it can't be with this motive of like, we're just doing this to try to get you in the church. And I think if the church is really going to be the church for young people, it has to say, we're going to embrace you as you are, with no expectation that you are right joining our tribe. And then let God do what God does, because I've seen young people authentically come to faith in that and find community. And I've also seen other young people who maybe only they got involved with the church because they were really looking for love and support. And then when they hit a place where they weren't so into church, and they said, well, the people at the church, they seem to not care about me once I stopped coming to church. And that's just such an awful testimony of what we believe, right? Of that, right? That we believe in a God who sends rain, right, on the righteous and the wicked, and the sun to shine, right? Like you gotta just be willing to love and embrace and support and serve young people for what they need, even if they with a mindset of, even if they never come and join my tribe, right? It's still God's call for me to love and support and serve these young people.
The shame is that the church, who should be one of the most credible messengers, have become probably one of the most least credible messengers with young people. And one of the things that I do when I meet young people, we gave 3 scholarships. I fought my church. I literally fought them to give 3 scholarships to 3 kids in Orange High School who did not necessarily go to church. And I asked them to give them to kids who were about to fail out, but pulled themselves together and graduating. Somebody did great community service, and we named them after 2 mothers of the church. And it was a fight to get $3,000 from the church that we raised to give to kids in the community. And what I told the young ladies was 3 young women who we gave scholarships to. I said, I don't care if you ever set foot in this church again. I don't care if you never come here for Sunday service. I want to make sure that we give you something to help you along the rest of your life's journey. And that's what my whole motivation for this for. I'm not doing this because I don't want more church members. I want more young people to do well and to have amazing lives and to go on to do great things. And hopefully this little seed that we're sowing into you will be something that will bloom into something great in your life long term. And that message resonates with young people more than, you got to give your life to the Lord. Jesus is watching you. Because people don't have a God problem. I don't think young people have a God problem. They have a God messenger problem. They have a problem with the people who claim to represent Jesus. So we have to be more credible as the church in being able to say people that we love people in spite of no matter who they are, what they are, that we love unconditionally. And that will make us credible.
Can I just add one more thing? It's like
y'all on the roll. Go ahead, Reverend.
But when I've seen young people become the most interested in prayer or going to church is when I go to court with them. And I don't even bring it up. But we sitting on that bench waiting for 7 hours because you don't get a court time, you get a court date, and they're stressed. And they come, can you pray for me? Right? Can you pray for the court date? Absolutely. If you want me to pray, I will pray. I've had more parents say, where's your church? Right. And again, it's like Bishop said, right? You meet young people where they are, not with the intent to try to get them in your church, but you provide genuine love and support, and people go, I want to get some more of that. But again, you got to be willing to do it without the expectation of, I'm just doing this to get you in my church.
Yeah, and I have to say something here. I'm looking at the time. We scheduled that like 1:40, 1:42, we get out in the breakout rooms. There are 2 questions. One of them from Ben has sort of already been answered. I will ask that, but I have to, I just feel the spirit moving. One of I don't, some people still call me a young person. I don't know if 29 years old is still a young person. But I have been a member of multiple churches, and I kept leaving because I understand that the church is made up of people are imperfect, and we need to meet them where they are and think about God's grace and mercy and the fruit of the Spirit and all of that. But I have had a serious problem seeing where pastors are so, and it's not all, but I've seen pastors that are so caught up in the number of people that are sitting in their pews or that are tuned in online, right? And like all the work is always within the 4 walls and now within the 4 corners of Zoom. And I can't wrap my head. I'm like, yo, there are so many like day-to-day people within our communities that need real life help and real life support. And not just on Thanksgiving, and not just on back to school, and not just on Christmas, all year round. And it's like, when we read these scriptures daily, we read them at Bible studies, whether it's in person or virtual, we read them, on Sunday mornings and all of that, but how are we actually really putting this into practice? And also, I think some pastors get so caught up in, especially with, each church has its own kind of hierarchy or way of doing things. And the Baptist church is more autonomous, the pastor of their own church, they can decide to do things how they want to do it. And maybe they just check in with their trustees or their deacons. The AME church is like a top down. And so a lot of pastors have this ambition, I want a bigger church. I want, to run for bishop one day and all of this. And so they get so caught up and they bring on young people like me, and they're like, we need you to bring young people in here. But it's not working because of all the reasons that you've mentioned, right? So anyway, I digress. And I love the church, but we have to step outside of our comfort zone, and we have to show, and we have to be willing to step out of our comfort zone to meet young people where they are, and meet them in the courtroom, right? Meet them in these places that we normally maybe would not want to go, and realize that everything doesn't have to be seen. Everything doesn't have to be on camera. Everything doesn't have to be, oh, look what our church is doing. Like, at the end of the day, we have to answer, right, for the things that we did and we didn't do. And because we're not in the community, like really inside of the community, so many of our families and our folks are suffering because we are the missing link, I think, oftentimes. So Ben asked this question, and it's already, I think it's already been answered. Ben, if you feel like you still need, would like to hear more responses for this, let me know. Have you worked in communities where recruitment of willing, credible messengers is a challenge? And I remember Reverend Austria and even you, Bishop Ferguson, touching on this. Jeremy asked the question, and I think this will be our last question before we transition into the our breakout groups. What are 3 steps that a pastor can take in their church? Maybe we can also include like faith-based leaders in their church today to start engaging young people and credible messengers. I think you've answered this, but if we can each go around, and if you have, it might be a repeat of what you've shared, but 1 to 3 steps that a pastor or a faith-based leader can take in order to engage young people and credible messengers.
I say, listen to the kids. We say with the formerly incarcerated community, and I heard Eliana say it earlier, don't talk about us without us. So you can't have meetings about what you're going to do with the kids without the kids involved in it. So you have to have conversations with the young people and ask them what they want. I'm meeting with my young people at the church once a month when we sit down and have some chicken wings or pizza or something. And now we're going to be doing it by Zoom, but I just listen to tell me what they want. Tell me what you're getting out of the sermons. Tell me what you're not getting out of it. Tell me what we can do to better serve you. What can we do to help you? I think that's one thing. And the second thing is to go outside of the walls of the church. You can't stay inside your church and think you're going to do any, not that the work inside the church is not meaningful, but the whole idea of doing the church work inside the church is to motivate people to go and to work outside of the church. So you have to get outside of your 4 walls. And the last thing I'll say is stop having churches, start being the church. Stop having worship services and start actually doing the work of evangelism. That's actually, to me, what credible messengering is all about, is a very high and evolved and powerful form of evangelism. Because the idea of evangelism is just going out and giving the good news. And a credible messenger goes out and gives the good news of, I've been there, done that, and I'm doing something else now, and you can too. It don't get no better than that. It doesn't get any greater. It doesn't get any more powerful than that. So I think those are the 3 things I would tell.
I think I would co-sign on not only what Bishop Ferguson just said, but all the examples that they gave earlier in the conversation of different ways that faith-based spaces could just be more connecting with community, young people. And I think just spread the word more is what I would say, right? And spread the impact more, and really just be more opening and welcoming when you are bringing new members or new people into your space. Again, going back to what Bishop Ferguson was saying about the point is to be out in the community doing the work, right? And what that looks like in his example of when he went and got the kids from McDonald's, like stories like that should be more common. And yeah, I wouldn't be the expert on what necessarily faith-based spaces should be doing, but again, just co-signing on both of the recommendations that Bishop Ferguson and Reverend Austria shared.
Reverend Austria, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, if I had to give 3, what I said, go to court with young people or visit them one-on-one in detention. Oh, 2, let's say you're a church that doesn't have credible messengers, right? And we run into that sometimes too. Sometimes it's the the new church plants, and they got people who are sort of new to the neighborhood, and they're like, we want to help. And it's kind of like your church is probably not necessarily going to be the front line of people, but get into a partnership, right? And join up with a church that does have credible messengers. There's a great example of that in the United Methodist Church in Chicago. There's a pastor there, Robert Beekman, but they've got this great practice where a lot of the suburban churches who are part of the denomination are like, the best thing that we could do right now is also to raise funds to help the churches that do have credible messengers bring those credible messengers on staff so that they can be paid for the work. The other thing I'll just say for pastors too is it makes a big difference when the senior pastor says mentoring is a ministry of the church, and mentoring is a ministry of the church that is just as God ordained as leading worship or ushering, or because what you see is a lot of people who are very committed to the church, but if the church doesn't really kind of bless and affirm and uplift that ministry as like, no, it is good for you to do this mentoring ministry, there are people who are going to be like, I feel like to be a first class church member, I need to be doing something that's in the pulpit, in the service, or I'm not really, or I'm just kind of out there, right? And I've seen churches who have said, we're going to officially make mentoring a ministry of the church, and this person is going to be over that ministry, and have the blessing of the church that no, that service of mentoring or that service of working with young people outside the church is just as much ministry as teaching Sunday school or singing in the choir, and being affirmed for that and uplifted for that.
Woo! Thank you so much, Eliana, Bishop Ferguson, and Reverend Austria. Thank you so much for just enlightening us about the role of faith, the importance of engaging as faith leaders, people of faith, pastors, congregations, getting involved in mentoring and incredible messenger mentoring, and not being afraid to step out of our comfort zone, to stop having church and start being the church, and realizing that mentoring is a pathway to evangelism. I have really put Leanne on the spot, but she has been very gracious for our group. Leanne, would you be willing to report out? And I think for reporters, maybe we can do at least 2 minutes each.
All right, I don't know if I have that, but I'm going to bring out a couple of points that came out in our conversation. We were just talking about highlights. One observation that was made was that sometimes the community and families have developed a fear of young people who are in the system, either based on their own experience or other things, and that there's a need for education for what I think the term was regular people, to understand the process of how young people get on this path in order for them to then be able to care for them and to meet their needs. And so that was one point that came out in the conversation. Another point is a disconnect in terms of wanting to serve people rather than trying to bring them into church. This is around the whole viewing the purpose of church and community, and finding the ways to take down the walls and change what we do as faith communities. And a point in this conversation was that the time is really great now for reimagining church anyway. Mass incarceration affects all of us. There are lots of people disaffected from church, and so it's a great time to reimagine and to really integrate positive youth development model in church, and an agenda to love and serve people as they are, where they are. And then the third point that came out in our conversation is that when we are the church, more than just sitting in the sanctuary, we would naturally do this, welcome credible messengers and so forth, and the necessity of being really intentional about it. And that examples of things like actually interacting with basketball and pizza and conversation and things like that are ways of being church with young people, and not simply hauling them into service. So those were a couple of the points that came out from our conversation.
Thank you so much, Leanne. And our next reporter will be either Angel or Angel Maldonado.
Yep. I'll go ahead and share. We had a great discussion. We talked about the things that inspired us just from our time together, is the community that we're able to build, and just the need for us as pastors to collaborate and to get training from community organizations who are, well versed in these different areas in which we were trying to serve, but seeing the importance of pastors, that, hey, it starts at the top, especially with when you lead a group of people and you have the influence to be able to move them into some of these positions of servitude. So we talked about the opportunities to connect with kids at a younger age and reach families, so the earlier the better. And even we talked about bringing people to church, just how important it is just to speak the same language, that when we're saying that, we're not saying to come to a Sunday service per se, but to be connected with a community of loving people, who are invested in their lives with the love of Christ. So, and then on resources, we appreciate these forums for the networking and connections we get to make. Would love to get connected with partners who are willing to help financially, especially help the organizations, the grassroots organizations, to be able to just build their capacity and have what they need to continue in their work. And then we talked about a field guide of, hey, if we want to get something like this started, how does it go from A to Z? So those are the things that we talked about. And then action items, the main thing for most of us was, hey, let's just start with connecting with each other outside of this meeting. But we're very grateful for y'all hosting it.
Thank you, Pastor Maldonado. Thank you so much. And last but certainly not least is Professor Ben Peterson, who will report out for room one.
Okay, thank you. So for question, our group had a lot of, I think, really great insights. So I'm just going to capture, a few quick ones. In terms of question one, what the group found encouraging or discouraging and prompted more questions. On the one hand, there was some discouragement, I think, that what was mentioned in the panel a few times, just about kind of the lack of engagement that a lot of people working in this field have felt from churches, lack of really understanding of knowing what to do and how to be involved effectively. And but on the other hand, at the same time, several members of our group expressed kind of excitement about all the people on the call today, people that are learning about this credible messenger mentoring and opportunities there, opportunities to kind of chip away at barriers that a lot of churches have put up. Another interesting point in that first conversation was about this notion of how to, especially on the research side, how to conceptualize love and the effect of love, which is kind of, again, there's an absence of it, but also an opportunity for pursuing more of that kind of work. Question two, in terms of what kind of resources we might need, sort of like the member of the last speaker for the last group said, one idea was to have some kind of short descriptions of maybe lessons learned from different experiences with credible messenger mentoring, so churches aren't starting from scratch if they want to build something like this. Some other opportunities for training and things like that churches, very technical training, how to identify credible messengers, these kinds of things. And then in terms of concrete steps, let me just put in a plug for a few members of our group are associated with the American Youth Policy Forum. And I believe they have a podcast. They're putting together a podcast that's going to be coming out later in the year in 2022. So just be on the lookout for that. I'll put in just a quick plug for that podcast on credible messaging and mentoring. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Leanne. Thank you, Angel. Thank you, Ben. At this time, I'm going to give our closing remarks, and then we are going to welcome on Reverend Dr. Denise Struthers for our closing prayer. Thank you all so much for being a part of this conversation today. There are clearly so many entry points into the work that needs to be done and connections to be made between churches and faith-based organizations, and connecting it to the tremendous opportunity for transformation when it comes to juvenile probation reform and practices like credible messenger mentoring. In addition to learning more about credible messenger mentoring from Mr. Clinton Lacey, we also learn from our inspiring panelists about opportunities that are clear for faith-based leaders and for a juvenile justice system that sees every child as created and loved by God, who are worthy of dignity and respect, and that works collaboratively with local leaders and organizations that serve as credible messengers to support young people and families in a variety of ways. There is an opportunity for the church and for the leaders in this room to provide the mentors and the people who take the time to listen and walk alongside young people and to advocate for change in your own communities. Here are the next steps for our time together. You will receive a short survey either later today or tomorrow with follow-up questions regarding today's event. Please help us to build on the learning process from today by contributing your responses, which will help this group's work continue going forward. We will also be in touch with information regarding tools and resources, as well as the information about the commitments made by your groups today, including future convenings of this group plus others to build lasting change together. Thank you so much again to our presenters, Reverend Austria and Mr. Lacey, our panel, Bishop Ferguson, Ileana, and Reverend Austria, and to each and every one of you for the gift of your time, your wonderful questions, the resources you provided, information, questions, and insights. And now I'd like to invite Reverend Dr. Denise Struthers to join us in a closing prayer. Reverend Dr. Struthers is the National Director of Operations at Healing Communities USA, and she serves on the Center for Public Justice's Board of Trustees. And as a side note, Reverend Struthers is very passionate about youth, and she has done a lot of research and work around protecting our youth from being sex trafficked, which is another major societal issue that often goes under the radar, that we often don't talk about, and especially now we rarely talk about in churches and congregations and places of faith and houses of worship. So without further ado, Reverend Struthers.
All right, let's pray, guys. Father, we thank you so much for just this opportunity for like-minded hearts to come together and to seek you. Anything that is based upon love, oh God. I know that you are for it, God. You are with us. You are right here in the midst of it. So I thank you for these servants. I pray over them, oh God, that your blessing will be upon them. I'm praying, oh God, that everything that they touch would indeed prosper in this year. Lord God, anoint the work of their hands, enlarge their territory, and whatever resources that are needed, people resources, financial resources, God, I'm praying that you will bless them with it, whatever it takes for us to reach these next generations, oh God. Those who have conditions, Lord, where they're being abused or neglected. God, you have given to us that mission, that calling as parents, as church leaders, as pastors, oh God. And so help us, oh God, help give us the heart, give us the desire to make a change in our communities, God. And so we want to see our young boys healed, oh God. We want to see our young women healed. We want to protect them, God. And so we're thanking you for the wisdom that has come through this vehicle, oh God. And Lord, allow us to come together often to discuss and whatever it is that we need, God, whatever wisdom that we lack or understanding, we're praying that we will get it, that we'll have the instructions on how to reach out so that many children will be saved in this hour. And we're thanking you so much for CPJ, Stephanie, and for Katie, APJ, all of them working together, God, and for such a time as this. And we give you all glory and honor. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you so much. All right, everyone. It's been wonderful. Thank you. Stay in touch, and we'll be in touch. God bless you and take care. Until next time.